Hello guys, welcome to The Fiction Wizard. Today we have an incredible story for you. What if Madame Pomfrey's emergency scan during feast revealed 73 compulsion charms and Hogwarts expelled Dumbledore live? If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The scan. The Great Hall smelled the same as it always did on the first night: roasted chicken, warm bread, and the particular kind of excited nervousness that came from 500 students remembering they actually liked this place. Candles floated. The enchanted ceiling showed a clear September sky. The Sorting Hat had just finished placing a small, terrified girl named Abigail Fern into Hufflepuff, and she was walking to her table with the careful dignity of someone trying very hard not to cry with relief. Harry watched her sit down and thought, good choice, and then immediately wondered why Hufflepuff felt like the right call for a girl he'd never spoken to. Then he stopped thinking about it because the food appeared. That was the thing about the start of term feast. It always appeared at exactly the right moment, when conversation was running thin, when people were tired of standing on the platform or sitting in carriages or listening to the sorting. The food arrived and everything reset. 500 people collectively decided that everything was fine. Harry loaded his plate without much enthusiasm. Across from him, Ron was already eating with the focused efficiency of someone who hadn't seen a proper meal since July. Hermione was pouring pumpkin juice and talking to Neville about OWL preparation schedules in the tones of someone who'd been planning this conversation since mid-August. Ginny was laughing at something Seamus had said. Dean was elbowing Seamus for saying it. Normal. Everything was supposed to feel normal. It didn't, quite. The summer had been Cedric Diggory dying in a graveyard and Voldemort rising from a cauldron and nobody believing either of those things, and then 2 months in his aunt and uncle's house where the silence had a particular quality to it, like the air before lightning. He'd spent the summer feeling like he was watching himself from slightly outside his own body. He'd thought that was grief. He'd thought that was trauma. He was about to learn it was something else entirely. Dumbledore rose from the head table, and the hall quieted with the practiced ease of 5 years of habit. Harry looked up at the old man, the long white beard, the half-moon spectacles, the expression of benevolent warmth that Harry had always found deeply comforting, and waited. "Welcome," Dumbledore said. "To another year at Hogwarts." Applause. Someone at the Gryffindor table whistled. "Before we begin, there is one small administrative matter to address." Dumbledore's tone was light, the way it always was when he was about to say something that wasn't small at all. Following the events of last June, the Ministry of Magic has issued Decree No. 42, which requires all educational institutions to conduct an annual baseline magical health scan for all students. Madame Pomfrey was already standing. She'd been at the far end of the staff table, and she walked to the center of the room with the brisk, no-nonsense stride of a woman who had been setting broken bones and correcting other people's problems for 30 years. She was carrying a long, thin instrument that looked something like a conductor's baton made of pale bone, trailing a faint silver ribbon of light. "This is standard," she announced to the hall, in the tone she used when students were being dramatic about Quidditch injuries. "Diagnostic sweep. It will take approximately 4 minutes and will feel like nothing worse than a mild breeze. Anyone who has a medical concern following the scan, please see me privately. The spell casts across the entire hall simultaneously, so there's no need to come forward." She raised the instrument. The spell was beautiful, actually. Harry noticed that even as he felt it pass over him. It moved through the room like a silver tide, unhurried and precise, touching every student with the same cool, impersonal attention. Neville straightened slightly as it passed through him. Hermione's brow furrowed, as though she'd felt something she didn't expect. Ron just kept eating. Harry felt it land on him and stay. That was the first strange thing. The silver light paused on him in a way it hadn't paused on anyone else. Just for a moment. He saw it happen from the corner of his eye, the faint gathering of the spell's attention, like a river hitting an unexpected rock. Then it moved on. He thought nothing of it. The 4 minutes passed. The hall returned to its baseline hum of conversation and silverware. Dumbledore sat. Pomfrey lowered the instrument and began reading the results, which apparently compiled themselves in a small, dense scroll that materialized in her free hand. She was scanning it with professional detachment, the kind of look she gave diagnostic charts at 2 in the morning when she'd already had a long day. Then she stopped. Harry saw it happen. The entire hall was talking, nobody was watching her, but Harry was. He'd been half watching her in the absent way you watch people doing administrative tasks, and he saw the moment she stopped. Her eyes went still on the scroll. The color left her face with a speed that would have been alarming on anyone else but on Pomfrey, who had the iron constitution of a battlefield medic. It was extraordinary. She read the scroll again. Harry watched her lips move slightly, counting. She looked up. Directly at him. "Mr. Potter," she said. Her voice cut through 500 conversations like a knife. The hall went quiet by degrees, Gryffindors first, then Ravenclaws, then the rest of them, until the only sound was the soft crackle of torches and someone at the Slytherin table hastily finishing a swallow of pumpkin juice. Harry set down his fork. "Yeah? Come with me. Right now? Right now." He started to push back from the bench, and something flickered in the air above him. The diagnostic spell was still running. He understood that in a distant way, that Pomfrey's instrument was still active, still cataloging, and as he moved, it flared. Silver light burst up from around him in a column, completely involuntary, like something had been disturbed. The hall erupted. Not in screams. In noise, sudden, confused, overlapping exclamations as the column of silver light organized itself into something legible. Because that was what diagnostic magic did. It didn't just report to the healer. It displayed. It had been doing so softly for every other student, a faint shimmer above their heads, green for health, the occasional yellow flag for minor concerns. Just light. Nothing to see. What appeared above Harry Potter was not nothing. It hung in the air in luminous silver text, casting enough light to read by 3 tables in every direction, and it said, "Active foreign enchantments detected, 73." Hermione made a sound like she'd been punched. Ron dropped his fork with a clatter that seemed enormous in the silence. Harry stood very still and read the number above his own head. 73. "What?" he started. "Don't move," Pomfrey said, and she was already crossing the hall toward him, her robes snapping with the urgency of her stride. Her face had gone from pale to something colder, more deliberate. The face she used when the situation was bad and composure was a professional obligation. The display above Harry's head wasn't finished. The diagnostic spell was still running, still classifying, and as Pomfrey moved toward him it began to sort the enchantments by type. Harry watched the words form in the air above him with the detached horror of reading a report about someone else. Compulsion charms, 47 loyalty bindings, 12 emotional dampeners, 8 memory adjustment residue, for miscellaneous behavioral modification, 247 compulsion charms. Harry's mind did something strange at that number, not panic, not yet, but a kind of fundamental reorientation, like a compass needle swinging. 47 things telling him what to do, how to feel, what to want. Layered over each other. Some of them, the scroll was already indicating, went back years. The hall was absolutely silent. Then, because diagnostic magic was thorough and entirely without mercy, the display did one final thing. It traced the enchantments back to their sources, standard practice in curse detection, the magical equivalent of checking fingerprints, and it listed those sources too. Most of the entries read, caster signature, APWB Dumbledore. 34 of the 47 compulsion charms. 9 of the 12 loyalty bindings. All 8 emotional dampeners. The silence in the great hall changed quality. It became the kind of silence that has weight. Harry turned his head and looked at Albus Dumbledore. The headmaster had not moved. He was sitting at the center of the high table with his hands folded and his expression, and this was the thing that would stay with Harry for a long time, his expression was not guilty. It was grieved. Like a man watching something collapse that he tried very hard to hold together. Like he'd known this was a possibility and had accepted it. That expression told Harry more than the scroll had. Harry. Dumbledore's voice was quiet. Meant only for him, across the distance of the hall, but every person in the room heard it because every person in the room was holding their breath. I can explain, Headmaster. Pomfrey's voice cracked across the room like a whip. She was beside Harry now, one hand on his shoulder, not restraining, anchoring, and her face had moved past coldness into something that looked, in a Pomfrey way, like fury. Controlled. Precise. Devastating. You will not speak to my patient. Poppy, you will not. She raised the diagnostic instrument and did something to it, a flick of her wrist that Harry didn't recognize, and the display above him compressed into a smaller, more clinical form, diagnostic shorthand, he guessed, something that could be transferred to official records. Then she turned to face the head table with the full weight of 30 years of professional outrage. 61 of these enchantments carry your signature, she said. 61 active behavioral modifications on a 15-year-old child in my care. Some of them, her voice wavered, just once, before she locked it down, some of them were cast when he was an infant. The word infant landed in the great hall like a stone dropped into a well. McGonagall stood up. Her chair scraped back loudly and she stood very straight and looked at Dumbledore with an expression Harry had never seen on her face before, not anger exactly, because McGonagall had a very specific look for anger and it wasn't this. This was something older and more terrible. This was someone who had trusted something completely and was in the first second of understanding that the trust had been misplaced. Albus, she said. Just that. Just his name. He looked at her. Minerva. The boy needed, don't. Her voice was almost inaudible. Don't you dare. Harry was still standing at the Gryffindor table with silver light cataloguing everything wrong with him, and he was aware of a sensation he couldn't immediately name. It took him a moment. It was the feeling of things making sense. Not in a comfortable way, in the way that an explanation makes sense when it accounts for every terrible thing you couldn't explain before. For years of decisions that hadn't felt quite like his. Of feeling pulled toward certain people and situations. Of anger that seemed to come from nowhere or vanish without reason. Of walking into danger again and calling it bravery when it had never quite felt like choice. 47 Compulsion charms. He turned back to Dumbledore and found he had nothing to say, which was unusual, because even in moments of rage Harry was generally a person with words. He just looked at the old man. He felt the silver light above him shifting and flickering with the changes happening in his emotional state, the diagnostic spell reading his reactions in real time, because that was the thorough cruelty of ministry-mandated health scans, and he didn't look away. Dumbledore looked back at him with that same grieved, accepting expression. It was necessary, the headmaster said softly. To Harry, to the room, perhaps to himself. You must understand, Harry, everything I did was necessary. For your protection. For everyone's, that was when the castle moved. Not physically. Hogwarts didn't shake or shudder. But every person in the hall felt it, a change in the ambient magic of the building, like a shift in pressure, like the moment before a storm. The torches burned lower and then higher. The enchanted ceiling darkened, the clear September sky vanishing behind something that had nothing to do with weather. The very stones of the floor seemed to settle differently. Harry knew, in a way he couldn't have explained, that the Founder wards had been listening. The magic of Hogwarts was old. Older than Dumbledore, older than any living witch or wizard's understanding of the school's full capabilities. The Founders had built more than a building. They'd built a place, warded and willing, capable of a kind of slow institutional judgment that operated on a timescale most people never lived long enough to witness. Apparently 61 behavioral modifications on a child in its care was the timescale it had been waiting for. A voice spoke. Not from anyone in the room. From the walls themselves, deep and resonant and carrying the particular quality of magic so old it had become architectural. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. The headmaster turned slightly in his chair toward the source of the sound, and for the first time his composure cracked. Just at the edges. You have used the trust of this institution as cover for the systematic violation of a student in your care. You have corrupted the foundational compact between guardian and ward. This school was built to protect those within it. You have made it complicit in harm. I acted for the greater, you acted for your certainty. There is a difference. The silence that followed that sentence was enormous. By the ancient authority of the Founder Compact, enacted in circumstances of willful harm to a student under Hogwarts protection, you are hereafter expelled from these grounds. Your access to the castle, the grounds, and all connected magical spaces is revoked. Your role as headmaster is dissolved effective immediately. You have 10 minutes to remove yourself. At 10 minutes and 1 second, the wards will enforce removal. Dumbledore stood slowly. Harry watched him. The old man was very still, and his face had settled into something that was not quite resignation and not quite defiance. Something in between. The face of a man who had anticipated this and had decided long ago that the calculus still worked out in his favor. This is not the end of the conversation, he said. Not to the castle. To Harry. Get out of my school, McGonagall said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Harry one more time, and Harry held his gaze without blinking, without the old instinctive rush of deference and fondness that usually accompanied Dumbledore's attention, and he realized with a cold clarity that the fondness had always felt slightly manufactured, slightly too present, slightly too convenient. He wondered how much of his love for this man had been his own. Dumbledore walked out of the great hall. 500 students watched him go. Nobody spoke. His footsteps echoed until they didn't. The torches returned to normal. The ceiling cleared. The Founder Ward magic receded back into the stones with the unhurried certainty of a tide going out. Harry sat back down. He picked up his fork. He looked at his plate. The roasted chicken was still warm. Harry, Hermione said. Her voice was very careful. Are you? I don't know yet, he said. Honestly. Give me a minute. She gave him a minute. Ron, across the table, had gone completely still in the way that Ron went still when he didn't know what to do and was trying very hard not to make it worse. That was a Ronism Harry was deeply familiar with, and he found, in that moment, that it was comforting in a way he couldn't articulate. Neville was looking at him from 2 seats down with an expression that wasn't pity. That was important. Harry had been on the receiving end of pity for so long he could identify it at 100 yards, and Neville's expression wasn't that. It was recognition. The look of someone who had their own quiet familiarity with the ways adults use children without asking. Luna, across the table, was eating a bread roll with perfect serenity. She caught Harry's eye and smiled. The Raxburts will clear now, she said. They cluster around compulsion charms, you know. You'll be able to think much more clearly. Right, Harry said. Thanks, Luna. You should eat something, she said. You'll need the energy. He looked at his plate again. Then he picked up his fork and ate. Around him, the great hall was beginning to process what had just happened, not loudly, not yet, but in the particular way of large groups of people who have witnessed something too enormous to immediately discuss at normal volume. The Slytherin table had gone into a very controlled huddle. The Ravenclaw table was already debating something in undertones, gesturing at the space where the diagnostic display had been. The Hufflepuffs looked shaken. The Gryffindors near Harry kept glancing at him with the protective anxiety of people who wanted to do something and couldn't figure out what. Pomfrey sat down beside him on the bench, which she had never in Harry's memory done before, Pomfrey sat at the staff table, always, that was an immutable rule, and she put the diagnostic scroll in her pocket and her hands on the table and said quietly, "I'll begin removing the enchantments tomorrow morning. Some of them will need to be done individually and carefully. It will take time." "How long?" "The compulsion charms, days to weeks, depending on how deeply some of them are embedded. The loyalty bindings are more complex. The emotional dampeners," she paused. "I'd like a mind healer present for those." Harry thought about what emotional dampeners meant. What it meant that he'd been carrying 8 of them. How much feeling had been blunted. How much of his grief, his joy, his anger, his capacity for any of it, had been running through filters placed there by someone else. "Okay," he said. "Tomorrow, then." "Tonight," she said, "I want you in the hospital wing. I won't begin removals, but I don't want you alone. I've got," he gestured at the table. "I know you have friends, Mr. Potter. They can come too, if they like." She stood. "Finish your dinner. Then come find me." She walked back to the staff table. McGonagall had retaken her seat and was talking quietly with Flitwick, both of them wearing the expressions of people rapidly recalculating the entire landscape of their professional world. Sprout had her hands over her mouth. "Snape," Harry glanced at Snape and found something unexpected. Snape was not sneering. He was looking at the spot where Dumbledore had been sitting with an expression that was complicated in ways Harry couldn't read, and when he felt Harry's gaze, he looked away. "Mate," Ron said. "Yeah." 73. "Yeah. That's," Ron stopped. "Started again." "Are you?" He stopped again. "I don't actually know what to say." "That's fine," Harry said. "You don't have to say anything." "I'm going to kill him," Hermione said. Very quietly. In the tone she usually reserved for announcing exam scores or identifying a logical error. The absolute certainty of her voice made it more alarming than volume would have. "Get in line," Harry said. "Harry, I'm being serious. What he did, what has been done to you, that's not just an ethical violation, it's multiple breaches of the International Statute on Magical Minors, it's..." "Hermione." He looked at her. "I know. I know exactly what it is. But right now I just want to..." He paused. He was searching for the right word and not finding it. "I want to finish dinner." She stared at him. Then something in her settled, the researcher pausing, the friend stepping forward, and she nodded and picked up her fork. They ate. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was real, and Harry was beginning to develop the sense that real was going to matter a great deal in the days ahead. The feast ended eventually, as feasts do, even the ones that happen after catastrophes. Dumbledore's throne-like chair at the center of the high table sat empty. McGonagall stood and, in a voice that was only slightly less steady than usual, said that students should go to their dormitories, that there would be announcements in the morning, that prefects should ensure their houses moved efficiently. Nobody moved efficiently. They moved in clusters, in whispers, turning back to look at Harry until the crowd sorted itself enough that he could walk without an audience. He found Neville at his shoulder as the Gryffindors filed toward the doors. "For what it's worth," Neville said quietly, matching his pace, "my gran has 2 on me." The scan showed. "Nothing like yours, but compliance charms. She had them put on when I was 7. He said it with the flatness of someone who had suspected this for years. "I reckon there are more of us than we think." Harry looked at him sideways. "You're not surprised." "I've never felt like my own bravery was entirely mine," Neville said. "I always thought I was just a coward who sometimes did brave things by accident." He paused. "Maybe I was brave all along and someone was just blunting it." Harry thought about that for the rest of the walk to the hospital wing, through the corridors of a castle that felt, for the first time, like it might actually be on his side. The hospital wing was quiet, the smell of antiseptic and drying herbs familiar and strangely calming. Pomfrey had already prepared a bed, Harry's usual bed, fourth from the left, which felt like either a coincidence or a statement. She'd pulled a curtain back to reveal 2 extra chairs beside it, which answered the question of whether Ron and Hermione could stay. Luna showed up too, which hadn't been discussed, but Pomfrey simply conjured a 3rd chair without comment. Neville appeared at the door, hesitant. I was wondering if, Pomfrey conjured a 4th chair and pointed. They sat. Harry lay back on top of the blanket still in his school robes and looked up at the ceiling, which was plain stone, no enchantments, no candles, just the cool pale ceiling of the medical wing and the smell of potions and the sounds of his 4 best people breathing in the dark. Can I ask something? Harry said. Of course, Hermione said. The loyalty bindings. 12 of them. He said it to the ceiling. How much do you think was real? With people. With decisions. He paused. Do you think there's a way to know what was actually me? Silence for a moment. Then Luna said, from her chair where she was sitting with her legs crossed and her shoes off, completely at home in a hospital wing at 10 at night, you chose to eat dinner. After everything. You picked up your fork and you finished your meal. Nobody made you do that. That was entirely you. Harry stared at the ceiling and thought about that. That was you, Harry, Ron said. Not elaborating. Not making it philosophical. Just confirming it. Harry closed his eyes. Outside the high windows of the hospital wing, the grounds of Hogwarts were dark and still. Somewhere beyond the wards, somewhere outside the ancient stone boundary that had, tonight, enforced a judgment that no human authority had been willing to make, Albus Dumbledore was walking away. And inside, in a hospital bed, with no compulsion charms telling him how to feel about it, Harry Potter felt something he hadn't felt in years. Something clean and difficult and almost painfully real. He felt angry. Not the hot, manufactured anger of a compulsion. Not the reflexive defense mechanism he'd learned to perform at the Dursleys. This was slower and deeper and entirely his, a cold fire somewhere in the center of his chest that said, with absolute clarity, no more. He didn't say it aloud. He didn't need to. He fell asleep with it still burning, and for the first time in 5 years, whatever he dreamed was not managed or moderated or nudged in the direction of someone else's plan. It was just his. Chapter 2, The Unraveling. Harry woke up at 4:30 in the morning because one of the compulsion charms broke on its own. He didn't know that was what happened, not immediately. What he knew was that he went from dreamless sleep to sitting upright in the hospital bed with his heart hammering and his hands gripping the sheets and the absolute certain feeling that something inside his skull had shifted, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. A sensation of pressure releasing. His vision swam briefly and then cleared, and the hospital wing was exactly as it had been, dark, quiet, for sleeping friends in chairs around him, moonlight cutting pale rectangles through the high windows. He pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum and breathed. After a moment he became aware of a memory he hadn't had access to before. It came the way repressed things sometimes do, not flooding back, not dramatic, just quietly present, as though it had always been there and he'd simply been prevented from looking directly at it. A conversation. 3rd year. Dumbledore's office. He'd gone up after Sirius escaped, after the Dementors and the night with the Hippogriff, and Dumbledore had offered him a cup of tea and said something very specific that Harry had entirely forgotten. Something about how Harry was doing magnificently, how the grief of his parents was a strength rather than a burden, how it was right and good that he felt such loyalty to the school and its guardians, and while he said it, he'd been holding his wand loosely on the desk. Aimed, Harry now understood, at Harry's cup. He sat in the dark and held that memory and felt the cold fire in his chest burn a degree hotter. He didn't wake anyone. He lay back down and stared at the ceiling and waited for morning the way you wait for something you've decided to face head-on, not with dread, but with a kind of flat, ready attention. At 6, Pomfrey appeared from her office moving quietly in the practiced way of someone who had been checking on him through the night, and she stopped when she saw his open eyes. "How long have you been awake?" she asked. "Couple hours. One of them broke." She was beside him immediately with the diagnostic instrument, reading the results with the focus speed of someone fluent in a language Harry couldn't speak. "The smallest one," she said. "A simple compliance nudge. It appears your magical core rejected it as the sedation lowered your mental defenses." She made a note. "Did you experience any pain?" "No. Just a shift." And a memory came back. She looked at him over the instrument. "That will happen. As the charms are removed, you may recover things that were suppressed. Some of it will be unremarkable. Some of it won't be." She kept her voice clinical, but her eyes didn't quite manage the same. "I want you prepared for that." "I am." "You say that now." "Madame Pomfrey." He met her eyes. "Tell me what you're going to do today." She told him. He listened with the careful attention he'd rarely given to anything that wasn't a Quidditch play or an immediate crisis, and he asked specific questions, and she answered them directly, and by the end of it he understood roughly what the next 2 weeks were going to look like, and he preferred that to not knowing. Ron woke up at 7, stretched enormously, knocked his chair backward, caught it, and pretended none of that had happened. Hermione had been awake since 6:30 and was already writing in a notebook she'd apparently had in her robes. Luna materialized a pastry from somewhere, nobody asked how, and Neville woke up looking like someone who had made peace with sleeping in a chair because he'd had practice. "Morning," Harry said. "Morning," several voices said back, with varying degrees of alertness. The castle stirred around them. They could hear it even from the hospital wing, the distant movement of students, the particular quality of noise that a building makes when its occupants are trying to behave normally while processing something enormous. There was an institutional hum of barely contained disruption that Harry recognized the way you recognize a storm coming. "McGonagall will have an announcement at breakfast," Hermione said without looking up from her notebook. "She'll need to address Dumbledore's removal. There'll be owls from parents by noon. The ministry will want a statement." She paused, tapping her quill against the page. "Harry, you should know that last night I wrote to my parents about what happened. I've also written to the Department of Magical Law and the Wisengamot's Child Welfare Committee." "You wrote to the Wisengamot," Harry repeated. "Someone had to." She looked up. It can't just be absorbed into the regular school year chaos, Harry. 61 enchantments from one caster. If we don't push this into official channels immediately, it disappears. Dumbledore has enormous political capital. He has allies in every institution. If there's not a formal record within 48 hours, it becomes a matter of context and necessity, and the whole thing gets buried. Harry thought about that. "You're right. I know I am. I meant that as agreement, not surprise." She almost smiled. "I know." Pomfrey began the first removal at 8 o'clock, after everyone had eaten. She was firm about that, in the way that Pomfrey was firm about medically adjacent things that could be easily avoided. She sent for breakfast from the kitchens and watched Harry eat before she so much as raised the diagnostic instrument. The first targeted removal was a compulsion charm that had been placed when Harry was roughly 7 years old. Pomfrey identified it by its age signature and its particular architecture, deeply embedded, old enough that his magical core had grown partially around it the way a tree grows around a fence. She spent 20 minutes just mapping it before she did anything at all. "This one," she said, half to herself and half to him, "is telling you that you are fundamentally unworthy of attention or care. It's been building that baseline for 8 years. The room went very quiet. Ron had gone rigid. Hermione had stopped writing. Neville was looking at the floor. Luna was looking at Harry with the particular softness of someone who had already known something like this and was grieving the confirmation. "That's why," Harry said slowly, "I never, at the Dursleys. I never asked for anything. I always assumed that any help offered was going to be withdrawn. Likely, yes, Pomfrey said. Among other effects. She met his eyes. This one will hurt. Not physically. But when I remove it, you may feel, do it, he said. She did. It lasted about 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds Harry pressed his back against the headboard and gripped the bed rail and breathed through whatever was happening, which was difficult to describe from the inside but which felt like having an argument with yourself in a language you've only just realized was your first language all along. His vision blurred. His jaw was tight. He was aware of Hermione standing up from her chair and Ron moving forward, and he shook his head once. Not now, don't, let me have this, and they stopped. When it was done he sat for a moment. Okay, he said. Okay? Pomfrey asked. I think so. He was assessing internally with the careful inventory of someone checking themselves after a fall. The world looked, not different exactly. But like something had stopped pulling at the corner of his vision. Like he'd been walking with a stone in his shoe for so long he'd stopped noticing it, and now it was gone, and the absence itself was the remarkable thing. Yeah. Do the next one. We should wait at least an hour between removals. You said that for the deeply embedded ones. Was that one deeply embedded? Pomfrey looked at him. No. Then let's keep going. They did 4 removals in the first session, pausing between each one while Pomfrey monitored his magical core's response and Harry sat with whatever came up. The second removal was a charm that had been depressing his academic interest in anything except defense and the bare minimum required for survival, a targeted narrowing of his intellectual engagement. When it came off, Harry sat for a full 2 minutes with the expression of someone hearing music for the first time. Is this what thinking normally feels like? He asked. I imagine so, Pomfrey said. It's loud, he said, and he sounded genuinely startled, and Hermione made a noise that she quickly converted into a cough. The third was a loyalty binding that had been tying his emotional trust specifically to Dumbledore's judgment. When that one came off, the cold fire in his chest got quite a bit hotter. He didn't say anything about it, but something in his face must have changed because Ron looked at him carefully and said, quietly, "You all right?" "I'm very all right," Harry said, which was not quite the same thing. The fourth was complicated enough that Pomfrey stopped halfway through and said she needed an hour to recalibrate her approach, which Harry accepted without argument. He was tired in a new way, not physical exhaustion but the particular fatigue of a mind that had been operating under artificial constraints suddenly running at a different capacity. Like a muscle that hadn't been used properly in years, suddenly asked to carry weight. He swung his legs off the bed and stood up. "I want to walk." "You should stay, in the hospital wing." "I'll stay in the hospital wing. I just want to move." She let him. He walked to the window at the far end of the ward and looked out over the grounds. It was a clear September morning, the kind that made Hogwarts look like an illustration from a book, crisp light on old stone, the lake flat and silver, the forest a dark green smear along the edge of the grounds. Beautiful. He'd always found it beautiful. He found it more beautiful now, and he wasn't entirely sure how much of his previous appreciation had been genuine and how much had been engineered, and the uncertainty about that was its own specific kind of grief. Neville appeared at his shoulder. "What does it feel like?" Harry considered. "Like someone's been playing music in a key that's slightly off. Not wrong enough to immediately identify. Just off. And now it's stopped, and I keep waiting for the next note in that wrong key and it doesn't come." Neville nodded. "Mine were smaller. Only 2. But I know what you mean about waiting. Have you written to your grandmother?" "Not yet." A pause. "I need to think about what to say." "She'll have reasons. She'll have what she considers perfectly good reasons." "They always do," Harry said. The morning moved. At 9:30 a knock at the hospital wing door produced Minerva McGonagall, who knocked once, waited, and came in with the bearing of someone who had spent the last 12 hours rebuilding the interior architecture of her professional life and was now ready to operate from the rubble. She looked at Harry for a long moment. "How are you?" she asked. "Getting better," he said. "For removed so far." "Good." She pulled up a chair without being offered one and sat, which in McGonagall terms constituted a significant informality. "I've informed the ministry. Fudge will likely send someone by tomorrow. The Board of Governors has been contacted and I have provisionally assumed the role of headmistress pending formal appointment. The Founder Ward Magic apparently transferred administrative authority along with Dumbledore's expulsion, so the practical management of the school is already mine." "The castle chose you," Luna said, from across the room. McGonagall glanced at her. "It would appear so." "A beat. Harry. I want to be direct with you. Please. I knew Dumbledore used certain interventions. With students. With staff. I knew the scope was broader than most would consider appropriate." Her voice was even and terrible. "I did not know the scale of what was being done to you. I did not know about the infant cast enchantments. I did not know about the emotional dampeners." She paused. "I'm telling you this not to excuse my ignorance but because I don't believe in lying to you, and the lie of omission I might have been tempted to tell, that I had no idea, that there were no signs, would have been false in ways that matter." Harry looked at her for a long time. "Did you know he was doing it to you too?" The silence that followed was its own answer. "There are 3 enchantments on me," McGonagall said finally. "All cast by Dumbledore. All oriented around professional compliance. Willingness to defer." She said it like she was reporting a patient's diagnosis. Detached and precise, and underneath it something that was absolutely not detached. "Pomfrey ran a staff scan this morning. Several of us are affected." "Snape?" Harry asked. "Extensively," she said. Harry turned that over. "Is that why he agreed to be here? Teaching somewhere he clearly hates, reporting to someone who," he stopped. "Is any of his behavior actually his?" "Some of it is certainly his," McGonagall said drily. "I know Severus Snape and some of his behavior requires no magical encouragement." But there was something complicated in her expression. "However, the degree to which he has been contained, controlled in his responses to you specifically, we don't yet know." "He must be furious," Hermione said. "He is not," McGonagall said carefully, expressing a great deal at this time. Harry thought about Snape standing in the Great Hall last night, looking at the empty chair with that complicated expression. He thought about what it would feel like to discover you'd been managed and controlled by the person you'd rebuilt your entire life around trusting. He decided that whatever fury Snape had was his own business and he wasn't going to borrow any emotional energy for it right now. "I need to know something," Harry said to McGonagall. "The Order. What happens to the Order?" She met his eyes. "Dumbledore is the Order." "That can't be true." "Not literally. But structurally, he founded it, he controls access to the headquarters, he makes strategy, he determines who knows what and when." She paused. "Without him present, the Order loses its center. It will fracture. Some members will maintain contact with him regardless of the school's ruling, they consider him irreplaceable and they're not entirely wrong. Others will wait to see how this unfolds." She looked at her hands. "And a small number will do what I intend to do, which is acknowledge that the fight against Voldemort must continue without being organized by a man who has spent decades treating people as instruments." Harry noticed she'd used Voldemort's name without flinching. He thought she probably had always been able to but had been gently charmed out of it. "Sirius," he said suddenly. "Does Sirius know?" "I sent a Patronus message at 7 this morning," she said. "I expect him before noon." Harry nodded and went back to the bed, because Pomfrey was giving him a look that indicated the hour was up and she was ready to continue, and he'd made himself a rule in the last 12 hours, he was going to do whatever needed to be done, and he was going to do it completely, and he was not going to ask for more time than he needed. McGonagall left. Pomfrey resumed. The fourth charm came off in fits. It was old and stubborn and had been reinforced at least twice over the years, like someone returning to patch a repair, and when it finally released, Harry sat very still and then said, to nobody in particular, "I wanted to be a mechanic." Silence. "When I was 9, he said. Before any magic. I found a car engine in the garage at the Dursleys and I spent 3 weeks trying to understand how it worked. I actually think I was good at it. I remember thinking I wanted to know everything about how engines worked, maybe fix them, maybe build them." He paused. "I haven't thought about that in 6 years." Hermione had stopped pretending to write. Ron had his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and he was looking at Harry with a careful kind of attention. "This charm," Harry said, "was blocking what? Practical reasoning?" "Mechanical, lateral problem-solving," Pomfrey said quietly. "And interest in non-magical solutions." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Non-magical solutions. Because a Harry Potter who thought laterally, who considered non-magical options, who relied on his own practical intelligence rather than the tools and strategies he'd been steered toward, that Harry was harder to predict. Harder to position. "Right," Harry said. He lay back and closed his eyes and for a few minutes didn't speak. The others let him have the silence without filling it, which was one of the things he was realizing he valued most about these 4 people. They could be quiet together. At 11:15 the hospital wing door opened and Sirius Black came in at roughly the speed of someone who had been barely restrained by physical barriers, wearing traveling robes, his hair disordered, and an expression that Harry recognized from photographs, the pre-Azkaban face, the one that had been buried under Dementor damage for 12 years, now present and fully operational and incandescent with a specific kind of rage that had nowhere to go. He stopped when he saw Harry. The rage flickered. Underneath it was something much more raw. "Hey, Sirius," Harry said. Sirius crossed the room in 4 strides and pulled Harry into a hug that communicated everything he apparently didn't have words for yet. Harry hugged him back and felt the cold fire bank slightly, not gone, not resolved, but recognized. "I should have known," Sirius said, into Harry's shoulder. "I should have known. I kept asking myself why you were so. You couldn't have known." "I knew he was doing something." "I didn't think." Sirius pulled back and looked at him. Really looked, the way he'd been doing since Harry was 14, the particular searching examination of someone looking for James in Harry's face and finding something more complicated. 61. "Working on it," Harry said. 4 down, 57 to go. Sirius turned and looked at Pomfrey, and his expression underwent a rapid transformation from grief to something considerably more purposeful. "What can I do?" "Sign the medical access form allowing the removal of all identified enchantments," she said, producing a scroll from her pocket with the practiced ease of someone who had prepared for this conversation. "As his magical guardian, your authorization alongside Harry's own consent speeds the process considerably and provides legal backing for the medical record." Sirius signed it before she finished speaking. Hermione caught Harry's eye. "See," her expression said. "Official record. It matters." Harry nodded slightly. Sirius pulled a chair over and joined the group without being invited, which was entirely correct behavior. He and Ron exchanged a nod. He looked at Neville with a kind of respectful assessment. He looked at Luna with the expression of someone who found her deeply confusing and was deciding that was probably fine. "What's the plan?" Sirius asked Harry. "Finish the removals. Then figure out what I actually am without them." "And Dumbledore?" Harry thought about the old man walking out of the Great Hall with that expression of grieved certainty. "He'll come back at us through the Order, through the Ministry, through whatever allies he has. He thinks he's right. That means he won't stop." He paused. "So we make sure the official record exists before he can influence the narrative." Hermione's already working on that. Sirius looked at Hermione. Good. I've also identified, Hermione said, glancing at her notes, that 7 of Harry's enchantments carry a secondary caster signature alongside Dumbledore's. I think someone was helping him, someone else was casting, or at minimum reinforcing, some of these charms. I can't identify the secondary signature yet. I need access to Hogwarts historical spell records. Who has access to those? Harry asked. Everyone looked at the door, as though McGonagall would conveniently appear. I'll ask, Sirius said. The afternoon brought McGonagall's announcement at lunch. Harry wasn't in the Great Hall for it, but Neville went and reported back. McGonagall had addressed the student body with characteristic directness. Dumbledore's role as headmaster had been dissolved by the Founder Wards, she was acting headmistress, classes would resume tomorrow, and the health and safety of every student was the institution's primary concern. She'd said this last part in a tone that, according to Neville, had made even the 7th-year Slytherins look reassured. There had been questions. McGonagall had answered 3 of them and deflected the rest with the particular expertise of someone who had managed the aftermath of several different species of catastrophe and knew exactly how much information to give to 500 teenagers. The owls arrived exactly when Hermione had predicted, noon, an avalanche of them, scrolls dropping onto the staff table like a particularly aggressive snowfall. Harry caught a glimpse of McGonagall opening them with the resigned efficiency of someone who had expected this and was getting through it. One owl came for Harry directly. He opened it without recognizing the seal. Mr. Potter, my name is Gawain Robards. I am a senior investigator with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. I have been assigned to the matter of the enchantments discovered during last evening's scan. I will be visiting Hogwarts tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Your presence at that meeting is formally requested. The Ministry takes this matter very seriously. G. Robards P.S. Please do not make any public statements before we speak. Harry read the postscript twice. They want me to stay quiet, he said. Of course they do, Sirius said. Dumbledore is the chief warlock of the Wizengamot. Fudge is terrified of him and simultaneously terrified of anyone more powerful than he is. The Ministry doesn't know which way this goes politically yet, so they want to manage the information until they do. I'm not making any public statements, Harry said. Not because they asked me not to. Because I'm not ready yet. He folded the letter. But I'm also not going to that meeting alone. I'll be there, Sirius said. And me, Hermione said. We should have a solicitor, Sirius said. Magical one. I know someone. Griselda Marchbank's niece, she does civil rights work for magical beings and has been absolutely ruthless about ministry overreach for 20 years. I'll send for her tonight. Harry looked at Sirius and had a sudden vivid sense of what Sirius must have been like before Azkaban, the sharpness of him, the strategic quality when his mind was fully engaged, the way he became very still when he was planning and very loud when he wasn't. He found he liked it enormously. Pomfrey ran 3 more removals in the afternoon. The 5th was a charm regulating his emotional attachment to adult authority figures in a way that made him more biddable, more likely to assume that adult judgment superseded his own. When it came off, Harry sat quietly for 10 minutes and then said, I want to be very clear that I've agreed to the Ministry meeting because it's strategically useful, not because a letter told me to come. Understood, Hermione said. Good. Just wanted to say it out loud. The 6th was a compulsion toward self-sacrifice, a charm that had been systematically amplifying his instinct to put himself in danger for others, to be the one who stepped forward, to be the one who took the hit. Pomfrey identified it with a particular kind of professional fury that manifested in the precision of her movements, each gesture slightly more exact than necessary, the way a controlled person's anger finds technical perfection. When it came off, Harry sat with it for a long time. That doesn't mean I won't still step forward, he said, eventually. No, Luna said. But now it'll be because you want to. Not because you were pushed. Does it feel different? Ron asked. Harry thought about it. Yeah, he said. The other way felt like falling. This way feels like jumping. The seventh was partially removed before Pomfrey called a stop for the day. His magical core needed rest, she said, and she had the authority to be firm about this, and she was exercising it, and Harry didn't argue because he could feel the truth of it, a deep, strange tiredness that wasn't quite his body but whatever was adjacent to his body, the space where magic lived. He ate dinner in the hospital wing, Pomfrey arranged it, and Sirius stayed, and the five of them talked about nothing in particular for an hour, the easy conversation of people who had earned the right to be small together for a little while, until the practical pressure of the world reasserted itself. I keep thinking about the sorting, Harry said, into a gap in conversation. What about it? Ron asked. The hat wanted to put me in Slytherin. I fought it. I remember the pull toward Gryffindor being almost physical. Like it wasn't preference. Like it was imperative. He looked at the ceiling. How different would things have been? You still would have been you, Hermione said. Would I? He said it without bitterness. Genuinely curious. Or would I have been something else without the charms steering me? Would I have been friends with you too if I hadn't been pushed toward Gryffindor? Would I have? I told you in our first year that you had a lot of bravery, Hermione said firmly. That was me. That was my own assessment. Nothing could charm me into saying something I didn't believe. A pause. The bravery was always real, Harry. The people who loved you, that was real. The charms found things that were already there and twisted them. They didn't create you from nothing. He looked at her. She looked back with the absolute certainty of Hermione Granger, who had done the research and arrived at a conclusion. Okay, he said. Also, she said, slightly more quietly, the scan found a minor compliance charm on me. Orienting toward academic authority. She said it quickly, getting it out. I've already spoken to Pomfrey about removal. I need you to know I'm telling you. I know, he said. I know your loyalty is yours. Yes, she said. It absolutely is. Outside the windows, Hogwarts had gone dark and quiet. The grounds held their usual nighttime sounds, the wind off the lake, the distant rustling of the forest, the creak of ancient stone. Somewhere in the castle the suits of armor stood at their posts and the portraits murmured to each other and the staircase moved with thoughtful deliberation. Somewhere beyond the wards, Dumbledore was making calls. Writing letters. Activating networks. Harry knew this the way you know rain is coming, not because you can see it but because the air has that quality. He also knew something he hadn't been sure of this morning, when he'd woken up to a single charm breaking and a recovered memory that made him want to put his fist through a wall. He knew he wasn't afraid. Not of Dumbledore. Not of the Ministry. Not of Voldemort, who was out there somewhere reorganizing his forces while everyone argued about everything except the actual monster. He'd been afraid his whole life. He'd thought it was just who he was, a scared boy who did brave things anyway, stumbling through dangers too large for him, surviving by luck and love and the sacrificial protection of a mother's spell. And maybe some of that was true. But the fear, the constant low-level fear, the way it had textured every decision and every relationship, that had not been entirely his own. Without it he felt like himself in a way he had no prior reference point for. Dangerous and calm and very, very clear. Sirius was watching him with that searching expression again. Harry met his eyes. I'm good, Harry said. I know, Sirius said. That's what I'm thinking about. What do you mean? I mean, Sirius leaned back in his chair, choosing his words with the care of a man who had spent 12 years with nothing but time and thought. James was the most capable person I ever knew. And Lily was, she was extraordinary in ways James and I were barely clever enough to recognize. And you're sitting there after the worst day of your life, 7 charms removed, more to come, and you're not falling apart. You're calibrating. He paused. The charms were holding back something, Harry. Not creating something. And what was being held back is, he stopped. Is what? Harry asked. Sirius looked at him with something that was equal parts pride and honest apprehension. Is going to be something nobody in this wizarding world is quite ready for, he said. The fire in the hearth at the end of the ward crackled. Luna was asleep in her chair with the uncomplicated serenity of someone who had expected this conversation and found it went exactly as predicted. Harry looked at his hands. They looked like they always had. A bit scarred. A bit worn. The lightning bolt scar on his forehead ached faintly, as it sometimes did, less than usual, actually. He wondered if some of the charms had been amplifying that connection too, making him more porous to whatever lived in Voldemort's mind, keeping that channel open for reasons that probably served Dumbledore's purposes in ways Harry didn't want to think about tonight. Tomorrow. He'd think about that tomorrow. Tonight he was 7 steps closer to himself than he'd been yesterday. He lay down and pulled the blanket up and closed his eyes, and the cold fire in his chest burned steady and clean, and somewhere in the walls of Hogwarts the ancient wards breathed slowly with the patience of stone, and Harry Potter slept. Chapter 3, The Reckoning. Robards arrived at 9:58. Harry knew this because he was already in McGonagall's office, his office now. She'd stopped calling it anything else, sitting in one of the chairs across from the large desk with Sirius on his left and a woman named Cassia Vane on his right, who was Griselda Marchbank's niece, who had arrived by flu at 7 in the morning with a briefcase, 2 scrolls already drafted, and the particular energy of someone who had been waiting her whole career for exactly this kind of case. She was maybe 40, with close-cropped dark hair and ink-stained fingers and a way of listening that made Harry feel like every word he said was being filed, cross-referenced, and prepared for deployment. She'd spent an hour with him before Robards arrived, asking questions with the precision of someone who didn't waste words, and Harry had answered them all directly, and she'd nodded and made notes and said, near the end of it, "You're going to be a very effective witness." "I'm not planning to perform," Harry said. "That's exactly what I mean," she said. Robards came in with a younger investigator whose name Harry didn't catch, both in official ministry robes, both carrying the controlled professional expressions of people who had been briefed extensively and were still not quite prepared for the room. McGonagall sat behind her desk. Hermione was in a chair along the wall, which Robards' eyes slid to with mild surprise before he decided not to address it. "Mr. Potter," Robards said. He was a solid, square-jawed man who looked like he'd been an Auror for 20 years and had the kind of patience that comes from interviewing people who don't want to talk. He sat down across from Harry. "Thank you for seeing us." "You're welcome," Harry said. "A beat." Robards was clearly recalibrating. He'd expected a 15-year-old and had apparently prepared for a 15-year-old and was discovering that what was sitting across from him was something that fit the category technically but not practically. "I'd like to begin by saying that the Ministry takes very seriously what was discovered during last evening's scan, Mr. Robards," Cassia said pleasantly. "Before you continue, I'd like to establish the record. My client is Harry James Potter, age 15, minor, British magical citizen, Triwizard champion of last year's tournament, which itself involved multiple Ministry-sanctioned coercions, and the documented subject of 61 enchantments cast primarily by Albus Dumbledore, Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot. My client has provided his consent for removal of all identified enchantments, and that removal is ongoing under the supervision of Hogwarts matron. My client is present today as a courtesy. He is not under obligation. Anything discussed in this room is being recorded by me for potential civil and criminal proceedings. Are we agreed on those terms?" Robards looked at her. "You're vain." "I am. I've read your work." "Good," she said. "Then we can skip the part where you tell me the Ministry's hands are tied." Robards allowed himself one small, controlled exhale. Then he turned back to Harry. "Mr. Potter. Can you tell me, in your own words, what you experienced at the feast last night?" Harry told him. He was direct and specific and left out nothing. He described the scan, the display, the numbers, the signatures, Dumbledore's response, the founder wards, the expulsion. He described it the way he'd been learning to describe things since the charm removal started, not with the apologetic hedging and compulsive qualification that he was beginning to recognize as charm residue, but straight, like someone who knows what they saw. Robards listened without interrupting. His junior colleague was taking notes. McGonagall sat with her hands folded and her expression carefully composed. When Harry finished, Robards said, "Did you have any prior indication that these enchantments were in place?" "No direct indication. In retrospect, various things make sense." A pause. "I had a memory return yesterday, partially blocked, now accessible, of Dumbledore casting something on me in third year during what I thought was a routine meeting in his office. Can you describe? He was holding his wand aimed at my cup while talking to me about how healthy it was that I felt loyalty to my guardians." Harry kept his voice level. "I was 13. Robards wrote something down. "Have there been other recovered memories?" "3 so far. Pomfrey says more may surface as the removals continue. We'll need a formal pensive deposition of each one as they occur," Kasia said. "I'll draft the order today. The memories should be preserved before they shift or fade." Robards nodded, and Harry got the sense that Robards was actually doing his job here, not managing for the ministry's political comfort but actually processing a serious criminal matter with the competence the work required. It made him slightly more useful than Harry had expected. "Mr. Potter," Robards said carefully. "I need to ask you something difficult." "Go ahead." "Given the nature of the enchantments, particularly the loyalty bindings and the compulsion charms, is it your assessment that any actions you took in the past 4 years may have been directly influenced by these enchantments? Actions that could affect ongoing investigations, or, you're asking if you can use the charms as grounds to revisit previous events," Harry said. "The Triwizard Tournament. The Graveyard. Voldemort's Return." Robards didn't flinch at the name. Points to him. "I'm asking whether your account of last June's events, my account of last June's events is accurate," Harry said. "Voldemort returned. Cedric Diggory was murdered. I watched both of those things happen. No compulsion charm changes what I witnessed with my own eyes." He leaned forward slightly. "What you should be asking is whether the charms were designed to ensure I'd come back from that graveyard willing to report exactly what Dumbledore needed me to report, to exactly the people he needed me to report it to, in exactly the way that served his purposes." Silence. "That's a significant allegation," Robards said. "It's a significant situation," Harry said. Sirius, beside him, hadn't spoken once. This was impressive restraint from Sirius, and Harry was quietly grateful for it. The situation called for Harry's voice, not his godfather's rage, and Sirius had understood that and was holding himself with the controlled energy of a caged thing choosing its moment. "Let me be very clear," Kasia said, leaning forward with the specific purpose of making sure her next words were the center of the room. "My client is not disputing the reality of Voldemort's return. He is noting that the circumstances of his entire Hogwarts career have been systematically manipulated by the same individual who is now politically inconvenient to the ministry. I'd like the ministry to consider very carefully whether the instinct to use Harry Potter's compromised history to minimize his credibility is something you want to pursue. Because the alternative reading, that Harry Potter's testimony about Voldemort was provided under compulsion, by design, to serve Dumbledore's agenda, is politically much worse for everyone." Robards sat with that for a moment. "Nobody is attempting to minimize Mr. Potter's credibility," he said. "Good," Kasia said. "Then we understand each other." The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. Harry answered questions. Kasia redirected 3 of them. Sirius signed 2 official documents. At the end of it, Robards stood and looked at Harry with the expression of a man revising his understanding of several things simultaneously. "You'll be hearing from us within 48 hours, he said. "Formal investigation into the enchantments has been opened. Albus Dumbledore will be asked to present himself for questioning. He won't, Harry said. Robards looked at him. He won't come voluntarily, Harry said. He believes he was right. That means he'll cooperate with the investigation in exactly the way that allows him to explain his actions rather than answer for them. He'll come when he's ready, and he'll come with his own legal team, and he'll frame everything as necessity. Harry paused. I'm not saying this as a complaint. I'm saying it so you can prepare. Robards studied him for a long moment. You know him well. I thought I did, Harry said. Turns out I knew the version he wanted me to know. But the pattern of thinking, that, I think, was always real. He genuinely believes. That's not going to change because a scan embarrassed him publicly. Robards and his colleague left. McGonagall saw them out with the composure of a woman who had been managing ministry officials for 30 years and found them consistently less impressive than advertised. Kasia closed her briefcase with a decisive click. You did well. I just told the truth, Harry said. Most people find that more difficult than it sounds in official settings. She stood. I'll be at the Three Broomsticks in Hogsmeade through the weekend. Flu me if anything develops, which it will. She looked at Sirius. Anything from the Order yet? 2 owls, Sirius said. 1 from Moody, 1 from Tonks. Moody's is suspicious about everything as a default setting, so his skepticism about this is actually unusually calibrated. Tonks is furious and wants to know what she can do. The others, Arthur Weasley will come around, but Molly, he paused. Molly is conflicted. Harry thought about Mrs. Weasley and the proximity charms Pomfrey had mentioned in passing, Order-adjacent enchantments that had flavored the emotional environment of the burrow. He thought about Ron's resentment that had appeared and vanished strangely over the years. He decided not to think about it too hard until he knew more. What about Dumbledore's own communications to Order members? Kasia asked. I assume he's been busy, Sirius said. He'll frame it as a misunderstanding, Harry said. He'll say the diagnostic magic was imprecise, or the signatures were misread, or the context was missing. He'll find a technical point to contest and he'll use it to buy time while he rebuilds influence. He stood from the chair and stretched, feeling the stiffness of another night in the hospital wing. He's not going to come at this as a man who was caught. He's going to come at it as a man who has been misunderstood. McGonagall had returned and was standing at the door. She was looking at Harry with an expression that had become somewhat familiar over the last 24 hours, a recalibration she kept visibly performing, a woman adjusting to a version of her student that she hadn't expected but was finding, Harry thought, easier to respect. Classes resume this morning, she said. 3rd period for 5th years. I thought you might want the morning. I want to go to class, Harry said. She blinked. You're sure? I've missed enough of my actual education. He said it without heat. I'd like to see what it's like when I'm not being compelled to underperform in everything that isn't immediately useful to someone else's plan. McGonagall looked at him for a moment. Potions is 3rd period. Perfect, Harry said. Sirius made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite concern. The hospital wing released Harry with conditions, Pomfrey's conditions, which meant they were non-negotiable and included a scheduled removal session in the evening and an agreement that he would eat properly and not do anything that would interfere with the ongoing charm removal process. He accepted all conditions, collected his bag from the dormitory, his first time in Gryffindor Tower since the feast, which produced a brief, complicated silence in the common room before Seamus broke it by saying, "All right, Harry," with such perfect casual normality that Harry could have kissed him for it, and arrived at the potions classroom 4 minutes before the start of 3rd period. The classroom was already mostly full. The usual Gryffindor-Slytherin tension had been dialed up to something more volatile by the events of the previous night, and Harry could feel it as he came through the door, the particular electricity of 60% of the room feeling righteously validated and 40% of the room recalculating. Draco Malfoy looked at Harry with an expression that was working very hard to be a sneer and kept landing somewhere more complicated. Crabbe and Goyle were simply confused. Pansy Parkinson was whispering to someone. Harry took his usual seat. He opened his potions textbook to the chapter they were starting, Strengthening Solutions, and read it in the 5 minutes before Snape arrived. He'd never actually read the potions textbook before class. He'd never felt the pull toward it. The instructions were more interesting than he'd expected. Snape entered without preamble, robes sweeping, and there was the usual shift in the room, the tension of students whose skills were about to be assessed against their own self-belief. Harry looked up at him and Snape did something he never did. He met Harry's eyes briefly, directly, and then looked away and began writing the instructions on the board without his usual opening performance of making someone feel preemptively inadequate. He looked, Harry thought, slightly different. Not kinder. Not softer. But there was something in his bearing that he was standing differently. Or standing more, maybe, as though some ongoing effort to maintain a particular posture had been partially withdrawn. Today, Snape said to the room, we begin the strengthening solution. This is a moderately complex brew that will appear on your OWLS. I will expect clean technique and correct sequencing. He surveyed the class. Mr. Potter. Harry looked up. Snape regarded him for a moment with the expression of someone choosing their words with unusual deliberation. You have the base potion instructions. Begin with the bitterroot preparation. Do not deviate from the sequence. It was not, Harry noted, an insult. It wasn't warm, it wasn't kind, it was barely civil, but it was simply an instruction. Delivered like an instruction. Not like the preamble to a humiliation. Sure, Harry said. Snape's eye twitched slightly at the casual response. But he moved on to the next student. Harry began the bitterroot preparation. He read the instructions twice, which he'd never done before. He'd always rushed in and relied on Hermione's frantic whispers to correct his errors. Now he read the full sequence, understood the logic of it, understood why the bitterroot needed to be bruised before slicing and not after, and the understanding made the execution cleaner. His hands were steady. The knife work was better than it had ever been, actually. He had good hands, it turned out, practical and precise, and without the low-level compulsive anxiety that had always attended potions class, he could actually use them properly. 15 minutes in, Snape passed his workstation, glanced down, and kept moving without comment. Harry took that as high praise. The rest of the class went cleanly. His potion was a correct color, if not a perfect one. Hermione's, 2 stations away, was flawless. She caught his eye when he looked over and raised her eyebrows in a expression. He gave her a small nod. She looked satisfied. After class, in the corridor, Draco Malfoy appeared at Harry's shoulder. This was unusual enough that Harry stopped walking and turned. Draco had the careful expression of a Slytherin who was making a calculated decision about what to reveal and had decided to reveal slightly more than was comfortable. Potter, he said. Malfoy. A pause. Draco glanced around the corridor, students flowing past them in the usual post-class current, and said, quietly, my father old last night. I imagine a lot of fathers did, Harry said. He's not happy, Draco said, which was the understatement of the term. He has opinions about Dumbledore's removal. Another pause, and something shifted in Draco's expression, something that cracked the Slytherin composure just enough to be visible. The thing is, I ran a personal diagnostic this morning. Old charm, family magic, the kind the scan might not have fully classified. He stopped. Harry waited. My father has 3 compliance charms on me, Draco said. Flat. Quick. Like removing a splinter. Cast by him. Without my knowledge. They're oriented around family loyalty. Obedience to the Malfoy lines, decisions. He said the word decisions the way you'd say something you'd found under a rock. I'm telling you because, he stopped again, visibly working out why he was telling Harry, and arriving at an answer he apparently found uncomfortable. Because what's happening to you matters. And I'd rather be on the side of the thing that matters than on the side of my father, who is, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Talk to Pomfrey, Harry said. She can remove them. I know. Draco looked at him. I'm telling you first. Harry studied him for a moment. Draco Malfoy, who had been his antagonist since the first day of school, who had been a constant minor friction in every year, who Harry had always understood as a category rather than a person, the enemy, the bully, the Death Eater's son. Standing in a corridor offering something that was clearly costing him and asking for nothing explicit in return. Okay, Harry said. I heard you. That's all I wanted, Draco said, and walked away. Ron, who had been 2 steps behind Harry and had heard everything, came to stand beside him. Did that just happen? Yeah. Is the world ending? Possibly, Harry said. Or possibly the world's been the wrong shape for a while and it's just now starting to correct. They walked to lunch. The Great Hall was operating at roughly 80% of normal, the food appeared, people sat in their usual places, the Slytherin-Gryffindor tension ran its usual course, but the empty chair at the center of the high table had a gravitational quality that kept pulling everyone's gaze upward and then self-consciously away. McGonagall sat at the center now. She'd moved chairs, not into Dumbledore's throne-like seat, but to the center, a slightly more modest chair, no elevation, just the center. Harry noticed and approved without saying so. The afternoon was his according to Pomfrey's schedule, which meant the charm removal session started at 3. He went back to the hospital wing with Hermione and Ron and found Neville already there, doing something useful with a piece of parchment and looking up with the expression of someone who had been waiting. I wrote to my gran, Neville said. How'd she take it? She wants to call it a misunderstanding. A beat. I wrote back that it wasn't. He squared the parchment on the bedside table with unnecessary precision. She's coming Saturday. I told Pomfrey, she said she can have the 2 compliance charms removed by then so my gran can't just recharm me during the visit. The matter-of-factness of that sentence landed in the room with appropriate weight. Good, Harry said. I also, Neville reached into his bag and produced a small, dense notebook. I've been doing some research. About the founder wards. How they work, what the historical precedents are. Because this morning I found something. He put the notebook on the bed and opened it to a page marked with a folded corner, and Harry and Hermione both leaned in. The notes were careful and specific. Neville had found, in the library's restricted section, he'd used his prefect access and had not asked permission, which was its own quiet statement, 3 historical cases where the founder wards had been invoked. In each case, the ward action had been against an individual who had committed a willful harm. In each case, the ward's judgment had been final. There was no appeals process. Dumbledore couldn't petition to return. But here's the thing, Neville said, turning to the next page. The last time the wards were invoked was 1783. In that case, the expelled individual, a teacher, attempted to enter the grounds through Hogsmeade. Through the village. Because the ward boundary runs through the village perimeter. What happened? Hermione asked. They were transfigured into a garden ornament for 3 weeks, Neville said. The records aren't totally clear on the specifics. But the point is, the wards have a response to people who try to circumvent the expulsion. Dumbledore knows this, Harry said. He definitely knows this, Hermione agreed. Which means if he's going to act, he'll act through intermediaries. Through people still inside the castle. She looked at Harry. We need to know who else is carrying his enchantments. Beyond the staff scan. The secondary caster signature, Harry said, remembering yesterday morning. The 7 charms that had a second caster signature alongside Dumbledore's. Hermione nodded. I got access to the historical spell records this morning. McGonagall signed the request. She produced her own notebook, considerably fuller than Neville's. The secondary signature, I matched it. It took 3 hours of cross-referencing, but I matched it. Harry looked at her. It's Mundungus Fletcher, she said. A beat. Fletcher, Ron said. He was in the order, he was at Privet Drive, he was supposed to be. Dumbledore used Mundungus Fletcher. Mundungus Fletcher is a competent enough charm caster when he's paid sufficiently, Hermione said, her voice carrying the particular chill of someone who has discovered a depth of calculation they hadn't anticipated. He wasn't reinforcing charms out of loyalty or ideology. He was doing it for money. Which means Dumbledore needed someone with access to Harry who didn't ask questions. He had access at the Burrow, Harry said slowly. And at Grimmauld Place. And before that, when I was younger, before Hogwarts, there were Order members who did casual checks on me at the Dursleys. Fletcher was one of them. The room was very quiet. He was reaching in through Order-adjacent people, Sirius said from the doorway. Harry hadn't heard him arrive, which meant the door had been open and Sirius had been listening for some time, which was fine, that was Sirius, and his voice had a flat, controlled quality that indicated he was managing something enormous very carefully. Fletcher had access to you at intervals. Dumbledore couldn't maintain the charms himself without proximity. So he used a proxy. A pause. I'm going to find Mundungus Fletcher. Sirius, not to hurt him, Sirius said. To depose him. Cassia will want a statement. Fletcher's account of who commissioned what and when is going to be very useful in criminal proceedings. His jaw was tight. And if I happen to be extremely unpleasant to him in the process, that's between me and my conscience. Harry looked at his godfather. Don't do anything that compromises the case. Sirius looked at him. When did you get to be the sensible one? About 7 compulsion charms ago, Harry said. Sirius almost smiled. I'll behave. The afternoon removal session ran for 2 hours. 3 more charms came off, 1 compulsion toward docility in the face of adult power that Harry was particularly glad to be rid of, 1 emotional suppression on grief that made the removal considerably more intense than the others. Pomfrey had warned him. He'd sat with it for 20 minutes after, very still, and what came up was Cedric and his parents and the graveyard, and Sirius put a hand on his shoulder and didn't say anything, and 1 loyalty binding toward the Order of the Phoenix as an institution, which had apparently been compelling him toward organizational trust irrespective of whether that trust was warranted. By the time he got through it his total was down to 59. Progress, Pomfrey said. Progress, he agreed. At 7 in the evening, after dinner and after Sirius had left to find Fletcher and after Hermione had gone to write 3 more letters and Ron had gone to Quidditch practice because life, as Ron accurately understood, had to maintain some continuity, Harry sat alone in the hospital wing for the first time. Pomfrey was in her office. The ward was empty and quiet. Harry sat on his bed and looked at his hands and did what he'd been putting off doing since the removals began. He thought clearly and carefully about Voldemort. Not the abstract threat. The specific reality. Voldemort was back. Had been back since June. Had a body, had followers, was organizing. The Ministry was in denial. The Order was fractured. Dumbledore, who had been the primary strategic intelligence on the Voldemort problem, was expelled from his base of operations and had been spending his strategic energy, apparently, on managing Harry Potter rather than fighting the actual war. Which raised the question Harry had been avoiding: what had Dumbledore actually been building toward? With all of it, the charms, the positioning, the management of Harry's development and loyalties and emotional landscape. He hadn't been doing it for cruelty. He wasn't a cruel man. He'd been building something. A particular outcome. And Harry, released from the compulsions that had been steering him toward that outcome, was now a variable Dumbledore couldn't predict. He thought about the prophecy. He'd heard pieces of it, the Sorting Hat had carried what felt like echoes of it, and there'd been moments in Dumbledore's office over the years when the old man had seemed on the verge of telling him something and had pulled back. Whatever it said, Dumbledore knew it. And whatever it said had driven his entire approach to Harry's upbringing, education, and development. A tool, Harry thought. Not with self-pity. Just the clear assessment of it. I was being made into a specific tool for a specific purpose. And now I'm not. The question was what he was instead. He was still Harry Potter. He still had a scar and a prophecy and a Dark Lord who tried to kill him as an infant. He still had Hermione and Ron and Neville and Sirius. He still had 11 years of regular childhood and 4 years of irregular magical education and a natural talent for defense that had been real even if it had been amplified. He was still the person who had pulled Hermione into friendship by saying she was a nightmare to be around. He was still the person who had stood in front of a troll for someone he'd just insulted. He was still the person who had walked into a graveyard and survived and come back to tell the truth about it regardless of how many people called him a liar. That was him. That had always been him. The charms had shaped the expression of him, the direction of him, the management of him. But they hadn't created him. He sat with that distinction for a while, turning it over, feeling its weight. Then he lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling and felt the castle breathing around him, old stone, old magic, old wards that had made a judgment and held it, and thought, with the clean cold certainty of someone who has nothing left to pretend, all right then. Whatever comes next, he thought, is going to come at me straight. And whatever I have, I'll use it straight back. No management. No positioning. No more bending in directions I was pushed. The door to the hospital wing opened. He sat up. It was McGonagall. She was carrying 2 mugs of tea with the manner of a woman who had decided that certain conversations required tea as a structural support. She came in and set 1 mug on Harry's bedside table and sat in the chair that had become, through the repeated occupancy of the last 2 days, a chair with associations. I received a communication, she said. From Dumbledore. Harry wrapped his hands around the mug. What did he say? He said he wants to meet with you. She picked her words carefully. He said there are things you need to understand about your situation. He said he wants to explain, not defend. He specifically said not defend, but explain. He wants the conversation on his terms, Harry said. Yes. She looked at him over the rim of her mug. I told him you would consider it. I will consider it, Harry said. When I'm ready. When all the charms are off and I know who I actually am without his interference. He met her eyes. Tell him that. She nodded. Tell him exactly that, Harry said. Word for word. I want him to know that I know what I'm doing. McGonagall looked at him for a moment with the expression she'd been developing over the last 2 days, the recalibrated one, and said, he'll find it alarming. Good, Harry said. She drank her tea. He drank his tea. Outside the high windows the September night was clear and very deep, and the grounds of Hogwarts lay quiet under stars that were entirely indifferent to the politics of wizards, which Harry was finding, in some fundamental way, enormously comforting. Professor, he said. Yes. Thank you. For standing up in the hall. For saying what you said to him. McGonagall set her mug down. She looked at the window for a moment. I should have said it years ago, she said. In a room that mattered, to someone who could have changed things. Instead I said it when the castle had already made the decision. A pause. That's not heroism, Harry. That's being too late and at least being honest about it. You're here now, he said. Yes, she said. I am. The fire in his chest burned. Not cold anymore, warmer, these last hours, like something that had been fueled and was finding its right temperature. Not rage. Not quite. Something with more use in it than rage. McGonagall stood and took both mugs and said good night and left him to the quiet. He lay in the dark and thought about tomorrow, classes, removals, Sirius and Fletcher, Robards' 48-hour window, the Ministry's political calculations, Dumbledore's next move, Voldemort's reorganization, and the shape of all of it pressing in from every direction at once. He thought about it without the filters that had been managing his reactions to it. It was a great deal. It was an enormous amount. It was the situation of someone standing in the center of a storm with no shelter and making the assessment, okay, so this is what we're dealing with. He wasn't afraid. He fell asleep, and this time he dreamed about engines. Chapter 4, The Shape of Things. Umbridge arrived on a Thursday. Harry knew she was coming before she walked through the door because the castle told him, in the way the castle had been telling him things since the founder wards had made their judgment, a subtle shift in the ambient magic, not language exactly, more like weather change, like the particular quality of cold air before snow. He was in the middle of transfiguration when it happened, mid-sentence with McGonagall about the theoretical underpinnings of human transfiguration, and he paused. McGonagall noticed. "Mr. Potter?" "Someone new just came through the main gates," he said. He couldn't have explained how he knew. "Ministry, I think. The wards registered them differently than students or staff." McGonagall set down her notes with the deliberate care of someone filing the information for later. "Class," she said to the room, which had gone collectively alert, "continue your written work. 2 feet on the distinction between animate and inanimate transfiguration targets." She looked at Harry. "How differently?" "Like something the castle doesn't want here but can't refuse," Harry said. "There's a difference between the wards letting someone in and the wards welcoming them." McGonagall held his gaze for a moment. "You're perceiving the ward state directly. Is that unusual? For a student?" She picked up her notes again. "Extraordinarily. They found out at dinner." The woman was already seated at the staff table when the students filed in, short, squat, wearing robes the color of something that had given up on being a color, with a smile that occupied her face the way an uninvited guest occupies a sofa. Pink cardigan. Black bow in her hair. The particular stillness of someone who was performing relaxation. Harry sat down, loaded his plate, and looked at her once. "Hem," she said, to no one in particular, from 30 feet away. Ron looked at Harry. "Who's that?" "Dolores Umbridge," Hermione said quietly. She'd been researching since the afternoon, which meant she'd been researching since approximately the moment she'd sensed something new was coming, which meant she'd probably known since lunchtime. Senior Undersecretary to the Minister. She's been Fudge's right hand for 6 years. She's also, a pause while she considered how to phrase it, the person who sent the Dementors to Little Whinging last summer. Harry set down his fork very carefully. "The Dementors," he said. "I can't prove it," Hermione said. "But the timing and the authorization chain both point to her. Dementor deployment requires Senior Undersecretary sign-off and Fudge was in the Cayman Islands when it happened." She met his eyes. "She tried to have you expelled before you came back to school." Harry picked his fork back up. He ate a bite of chicken. He looked at Umbridge again, who was talking to Flitwick with the pleasant incongruousness of someone who had decided the best way to occupy a space was to look native to it. "Why is she here?" he asked. "Defense against the dark arts," Hermione said. "The Ministry has appointed her. It was in the Prophet this morning. I didn't mention it because you had the removal session and I didn't want to. You can tell me things," Harry said mildly. "I'm not fragile." "I know. I was prioritizing." She said it without apology. "She's here to oversee the defense curriculum. The Ministry's position is that students don't need to know how to cast defensive spells, they need to know the theory. She'll be teaching defense from a textbook. No practical work." "A beat." "No practical work," Harry repeated. "None. In defense against the dark arts. The Ministry's reasoning is that, I don't care about the ministry's reasoning, Harry said. Not loudly. Conversationally, the way you dismiss an argument that doesn't deserve engagement. What's their actual reason? Hermione looked at him. Control. If students can cast defensive spells, students can resist. If they can only recite theory from a textbook, they're dependent on whoever the ministry decides to protect them. Which is the ministry, Harry said. Which is the ministry, she agreed. Which is fudge, Harry said. Who is terrified of Voldemort existing and has been trying to discredit anyone who says otherwise. He looked at Umbridge one more time. So she's here to manage what students learn about defending themselves against a Dark Lord the ministry insists doesn't exist. That's about the size of it, Ron said. Right, Harry said, and ate his dinner with a focused, pleasant calm that Ron later described, to Neville, as the most alarming thing he'd ever witnessed. Umbridge's first class was Friday morning. Defense against the Dark Arts, 5th year Gryffindors. Harry arrived first and sat in the front row, which he had never done in any class in his life. Hermione came in, saw where he was sitting, recalibrated, and sat beside him. Ron came in, saw where they were sitting, said, "Oh, this is going to be something," and sat on Harry's other side. Umbridge arrived with a smile like a painted-on feature and a stack of textbooks and the air of someone who had already decided how the room was going to behave and was simply waiting for it to catch up to her decision. She wrote her name on the board, Professor Umbridge, and underlined it. "Good morning," she said sweetly. "Good morning," said the class, in the scattered, uncoordinated way of a class that hadn't decided yet whether this was a performer worth engaging with. "Welcome to Defense Against the Dark Arts." She clasped her hands. "I'm sure you've all had a varied experience in this subject over the years." She managed to make varied sound like a polite word for chaotic and probably criminal. "That will be changing this year. The Ministry of Magic has developed a carefully structured, theory-based curriculum that will provide you with a thorough grounding in." "Excuse me," Harry said. The room went still. Umbridge's smile stayed precisely where it was. "Yes, Mr. Potter? Will this curriculum include practical defensive spell work?" "The Ministry's position is that, will it include practical defensive spell work?" he said again, with the patient repetition of someone who has asked a specific question and noticed it hasn't been answered. Umbridge's smile thinned by approximately 3%. "For your OWL examination, theoretical knowledge will be, the OWL has a practical component," Hermione said, pleasantly. She was looking at her textbook as she said it, which made it worse. "Examiners have always tested casting. That's a matter of public record. The curriculum has been updated to reflect. Has the OWL examination rubric been updated?" Harry asked. A pause. "The examination rubric," Umbridge said, "is a matter for the examination's authority." "Which means no," Harry said. "The OWL still tests practical casting. So a theory-only curriculum would leave us unable to pass the practical component of our own examinations." He opened the textbook on his desk, flipped to the table of contents, read for a moment, and closed it. "Also, we've had 4 different teachers in this subject in 4 years. 2 of them were concealing significant things. 1 was under an imperious curse for most of the year. The cumulative practical deficit we're working with is, Mr. Potter." Her voice had taken on the quality of something with teeth. "I appreciate that you have," she paused, constructing something, "strong feelings about your own education, given your recent situation. But I assure you, the Ministry has. The Ministry sent Dementors to Little Whinging last summer," Harry said. The room didn't breathe. Umbridge's smile didn't move. But something behind her eyes did, a flash of something that Harry recognized because he'd been watching adults try to manage him for years and had recently acquired much better calibration for it. It was calculation. Not fear, not guilt, pure strategic calculation. "That's a very serious allegation," she said softly. "It's a documented fact," Harry said. Dementor deployment requires Senior Undersecretary authorization. The minister was abroad. You were the Senior Undersecretary on duty. He looked at her with the steady, interested attention of someone who genuinely wanted to see what happened next. I'm not making an allegation. I'm connecting documented facts. This is not the appropriate forum, you're right, he said pleasantly. That's why my solicitor has already submitted the authorization inquiry to the Department of Magical Law. That's a separate matter. He opened the textbook again. I just wanted to understand the teaching approach, Professor. Should we begin? 3 things were visible on Umbridge's face in rapid succession. The first was surprise. The second was something that wanted to be anger but understood the room was wrong for it. The third was a new kind of attention, the look of someone who has arrived expecting a particular kind of opposition and found something they haven't mapped before. She began the class. She taught theory. Harry took notes with the careful attentiveness of a student who was absolutely present and would not give her a single legitimate complaint, and he turned every single thing she said into a question. Not argumentative questions. Technical ones. Why does the Ministry classify this spell as dangerous for classroom practice when the Auror training program uses it in first-year conditioning? What's the theoretical basis for believing verbal description of a hex provides adequate preparation for encountering it? If a Patronus charm is on the OWL practical list, which module of the theory curriculum develops the emotional groundwork for casting one? She answered 3 questions before she called on anyone else. She called on Hermione, who had a question about the textbook citations that turned out to be genuinely, technically unanswerable, because 2 of them referred to papers that had been retracted. She called on Ron, who asked a question about the Crumb incident at the Triwizard Tournament with the innocent face of someone who had not at all planned this. She called on Neville, who wanted to know about emergency stunning applications in confined spaces. By the end of the class, Umbridge had taught exactly 15 minutes of her prepared material and spent the remaining 30 managing questions. She assigned reading for homework. She smiled the whole time. Her smile, by the end, had the quality of something structural rather than emotional, a load-bearing architectural feature rather than an expression. When the bell rang, Harry packed his bag and stood and said, "Thank you, Professor," with perfect sincerity, because he had genuinely learned things. In the corridor, Ron exhaled. That was beautiful. That was a preview, Harry said. She'll adapt. She'll start shutting down questions. She'll use her authority to reassert control of the room, probably next class. He shouldered his bag. Which is why we're not doing it in her class. What are you doing? Hermione asked. I'm thinking, he said. About what students actually need to know and who's going to teach it to them. She stopped walking. Harry. What? Are you thinking about starting a... I'm thinking about options, he said. I haven't decided anything. She studied him. You've decided something. He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him since the feast, and it was startlingly different from the smiles she was used to, more present, more itself, like a light with the dimmer switch fully up. I've decided that if the Ministry wants to leave 500 students unable to defend themselves against a Dark Lord while simultaneously insisting the Dark Lord doesn't exist, I find that unacceptable. What I haven't decided is the specific shape of the response. But there will be a response. There will absolutely be a response, he agreed. The removal sessions had continued through the week with Pomfrey's careful, clinical precision. By Thursday evening, Umbridge's arrival day, Harry was at 44 remaining charms, down from 73, and the progressive removal had begun to do something Pomfrey had mentioned as a theoretical possibility but apparently not fully anticipated in practice. His magic was changing. Not its fundamental nature, he was still Harry Potter with Harry Potter's magical core. But without the suppressors and the behavioral constraints, it was running at what felt like a different frequency. More responsive. More present. When he cast spells now there was a directness to the magic that hadn't been there before, less lag between intent and execution, like a translation that had been happening for years had suddenly become unnecessary because he was now speaking the language natively. He noticed it first in charms on Wednesday. They were reviewing shield charms, standard OWL preparation, and when he cast his, the spell was 3 times the size it should have been and lasted 30 seconds longer than standard, and Flitwick had to stand behind his desk to block the rebound. "Mr. Potter," Flitwick said, from behind his desk, in the careful tone of someone recalibrating what they thought they knew. "Sorry," Harry said. He wasn't entirely sorry. "I'll dial it back." "How?" Flitwick said carefully, "did you dial it up?" "I didn't, exactly. I just cast it." Flitwick emerged from behind his desk and looked at Harry with his head tilted slightly, like a bird investigating something new and bright. "Cast it again. Half strength, please, just for my reference." Harry cast it half strength. Flitwick measured it with a small instrument, looked at the reading, and looked at Harry with an expression that was entirely unreadable. "Come see me during office hours this week," Flitwick said. "Is that a problem?" "Mr. Potter," Flitwick said, "that is absolutely not a problem." Thursday afternoon, before Umbridge arrived, Harry had a session with Pomfrey that removed 3 more charms, including one that had been specifically dampening his wand work, introducing a fractional delay between his magical intent and the wand's response that had made him slightly less accurate, slightly less fast, for years. When Pomfrey removed it, Harry sat very still for a moment and then reached out and picked up a glass of water from the bedside table. Nothing remarkable about that. Except the glass moved toward his hand before he touched it. He and Pomfrey looked at each other. "Put that down," she said. He set it down. He focused, very deliberately, on not moving anything. The glass stayed still. He was aware of something that felt like pressure at the edges of his concentration, not trying to move the glass, but aware of the glass in the way you're aware of your own heartbeat once someone points it out. That, Pomfrey said carefully, was wandless movement. "I know what it was. Accidental wandless magic in adolescence is not unheard of. But that was not accidental." She was already reaching for her diagnostic instrument. "You intended it. On some level, you intended it." "I was reaching for the glass. With your hand and something else simultaneously," she said. "Your magic moved before your arm did." She ran the diagnostic and looked at the results for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Some of the suppressor charms appear to have been specifically targeting this wandless capability. The charms were layered over it quite precisely. As though whoever cast them knew exactly what they were suppressing." "Dumbledore knew what I was capable of," Harry said. "Apparently better than you did," she said. He sat with that for a while. Then he spent 20 minutes doing very careful, very deliberate exercises, reaching for things with his magic the way you'd stretch a muscle you've been guarding, while Pomfrey monitored and made notes and periodically told him to rest. He could move things. Not heavy things, not yet, or at least not without the peculiar deep effort of using something that hadn't been used properly in years. But a quill, a small book, the glass again. He could feel the edge of it, the capability like a door that had always been there and had simply been locked from the outside. He didn't tell anyone except Pomfrey and Sirius's reaction was to sit in his chair for a full 30 seconds without speaking and then say, "Your mother could do something similar." Not the same, hers was more precise, more spell-based, but the principle. A pause. "James used to say she didn't need a wand, she just used one to avoid frightening people." He looked at Harry. "Don't bother avoiding frightening people." "I wasn't planning to," Harry said. Friday evening, after Umbridge's class, after dinner, after the removal session that took 2 more charms, a nasty pair that had been co-suppressing his capacity for strategic thinking and his trust in his own judgment, which Pomfrey removed together and which left him feeling startlingly, uncomfortably clear for about an hour afterward, Harry went to find Neville. He found him in the library, alone at a table with 3 books open and the particular expression of a person who has arrived at a conclusion and is double-checking it before acting. "What have you found?" Harry said, sitting across from him. Neville looked up. "How did you know I'd found something?" "You have the look." "What look?" "The look of someone sitting on information and waiting for the right moment." He nodded at the books. "What is it?" Neville turned one of the books around. "The Founder Wards. I've been looking further. There's more to them than the expulsion precedent." He pointed to a passage marked with his thumb. "The wards don't just respond to harm. They respond to threat. There's a distinction in the historical records. They reacted to Dumbledore because he'd already committed harm. But for active, incoming threats, things or people that intend harm to students, the wards have a different response." Harry leaned in. "What response?" "Prevention," Neville said. "Active prevention. The wards can identify and block an incoming hostile intent before it reaches the castle. Not lock the gates, that's passive. This is active. The castle can act." He looked at Harry. "But it requires someone to interface with it. Someone the castle recognizes as aligned with its protection function." Harry looked at him for a long moment. "Me." "You," Neville said. "Since the expulsion, you've been perceiving the ward state. You felt Umbridge arrive." That's not normal perception, Harry. That's the castle communicating with you. I think it's been trying to since the feast." Harry sat back and thought about the night after the feast, the sense of the old wards breathing in the walls, the feeling of the castle being on his side. He'd taken it as metaphorical. He was beginning to think it was operational. What would interfacing actually involve, he asked. Neville pointed to the next passage. Harry read it. It was written in archaic but legible English and it described a deliberate act of connection, a caster with sufficient magical sensitivity walking the boundary of the castle's foundational wards while the castle itself matched to their signature. Not a ritual exactly. More like an introduction. The text compared it to a familiar coming to know a new wizard, a process of mutual recognition that happened through presence and intention rather than ceremony. The founders did this with the original wards, Neville said. They walked the boundary. They let the castle know them. He looked at Harry. The castle expelled Dumbledore because it already recognized you as the harmed party. But it's offering something more active. I think it's been offering it since the feast and waiting for you to notice. Harry thought about the feel of the wards when Umbridge came through. The castle doesn't want her but can't refuse. Official ministry access. Couldn't be blocked. Yet. If I'm properly interfaced, he said slowly, and the castle recognizes me as, what? A guardian? Then I'd have more than passive perception. Significantly more, Neville said. Harry looked at the passage again. This would need to happen at night. When the grounds aren't full of students. He paused. And I probably shouldn't tell anyone official about it until it's done, because the ministry would find a way to object. Probably, Neville agreed. Will you come with me? Neville blinked. Me? The castle knows you too, Harry said. You've been researching it all week. You've been, Neville, you have 2 charms coming off tomorrow morning and then you have your grandmother's visit in the afternoon. Tonight you're free and you're already thinking about this. He looked at him steadily. Also I trust you. Neville sat with that for a moment. He closed the books one by one with the deliberate care of someone taking something seriously, and he looked at Harry across the library table. All right, he said. They went at midnight. Harry had the invisibility cloak and they both went under it, not the most comfortable configuration, requiring a slight sideways shuffle to stay covered, and they went through the castle with the particular quiet of 2 people who had navigated these corridors in the dark enough times that they'd stopped being intimidating. The entrance hall was empty. The main doors were unlocked. Harry pushed them open and the September night came in, cold and clear, smelling of the lake and cut grass and stone. They walked out onto the front steps and stopped. "I've never walked the whole boundary before," Neville said. "Neither have I," Harry said. "But I know where it is." He did. It was the most natural thing, standing at the top of the steps with the castle behind him and the ground spreading out in the dark. He could feel the boundary of the wards the way you can feel the edge of a table in the dark, not seeing it but knowing it's there with certainty. A faint pressure. A sense of where the castle ended and the world began. He stepped down onto the grass and started walking. Not quickly. Not ceremonially. Just walking, staying aware of the ward boundary, feeling it to his left as he made his way along the edge of the grounds, and the feeling was reciprocal. That was the thing. It wasn't him sensing a passive thing. The castle was noticing him noticing it, and there was something in that mutual attention that felt like the beginning of a conversation. Neville walked beside him and was quiet, which was exactly right. The walk took 40 minutes. By the halfway point, Harry had stopped thinking about the mechanics of it and was simply walking and present, the cold air against his face and the dark of the grounds around him and the castle rising above them as they came around the far side, visible from here in a way it never quite was from the entrance hall, the full sweep of it, towers and turrets and windows and the sheer mass of 7 centuries of magical architecture. He felt the wards shift. Not dramatically. Not like the feast, where they'd moved with deliberate and public purpose. This was quieter, more like a handshake than a declaration. A recognition passing both ways. The castle knew him. Had known him as a student for 4 years, had been watching him through whatever institutional consciousness the founders had built into it. And now, with the charms being stripped back and his own perception opening up to things it had been suppressed from feeling, it was recognizing something more specific. He stopped walking at the point where they'd started. The circuit was complete. Nothing visible happened. No light, no sound, no dramatic architectural response. Just the night, the castle, and Harry standing at the door with the feeling of something settled. "Well?" Neville said quietly. Harry put his hand against the castle wall. Stone, cold and old and uneven under his fingers. And underneath the physical reality of it, something else, an awareness, like the feeling of standing next to someone who is paying close attention to you. Not threatening. Patient. Ancient. "I know you," he thought, not as a statement of fact but as an acknowledgement. Something in the stone thrummed once, very faintly, under his palm. "Well," Harry said. They went back inside. Harry walked through the entrance hall and up toward Gryffindor Tower, and the castle was different around him now, not obviously, not in ways anyone else would likely notice, but the perception he'd had since the feast was sharper now. He was aware of every ward node as he passed it, every point where the founder magic was concentrated in the structure. He was aware of 3 students breaking curfew on the 6th floor, Ravenclaw, by the feel of the wards in that section, and harmless. He was aware of a subtle tension in the wards around the corridor where Umbridge had taken up residence in one of the guest quarters. He paused at that. The castle's feeling about Umbridge was clear in the same way that water is clear, you couldn't miss it. She was ministry, she had legitimate access, the wards couldn't remove her without grounds that hadn't yet been established. But the wards were watching her. In the way a careful person watches something that hasn't yet done anything wrong but that they know is going to. Harry filed that away. On Saturday morning, Neville's grandmother arrived at 10. Harry was in the hospital wing for his morning removal session, 3 more charms, bringing him to 41, when he heard it, the sharp, purposeful sound of Augusta Longbottom's walking stick on the stone floors, growing louder. He knew it was her from the ward sense before she turned the corner. She came in like weather. Tall, upright, wearing her habitual vulture hat with the air of a woman who had never once in her life questioned whether the hat was appropriate. She looked at Pomfrey, she looked at Harry, and she looked at Neville, who was standing near the window with the expression of someone who had prepared carefully for a difficult conversation. "Neville," she said. Gran, he said. She crossed the room and sat in the spare chair and said nothing for a moment, looking at her grandson with the particular intensity of a woman who had raised a child and loved him and simultaneously done something wrong and was not used to being in that position. Pomfrey has explained the medical situation, she said. I know, Neville said. I had reasons, she said. I know you did, he said. And then, gently, with the particular gentleness of someone who has thought very carefully about this, I'm not saying you're a bad person, Gran. I'm saying it wasn't your decision to make. It was mine. A pause. It's always been mine. Augusta Longbottom looked at her grandson for a long moment, and the vulture hat did nothing to soften the expression underneath it, which was the expression of someone confronting something true. I was afraid, she said. Quietly. Not for the room. For Neville. After your parents. I was afraid of, I know, he said. You were afraid of losing me. I understand that, Gran. But you can't charm someone safe. He looked at her steadily. You have to trust them. The silence that followed was the most loaded one Harry had heard in a week of loaded silences. Augusta sat very straight. Then she said, Will you let me stay? While they remove them? Yes, Neville said. She nodded once, crisply, adjusted her hat, and sat with the hands-folded composure of a woman who was going to do this correctly even though it was costing her considerably. Harry's removal session continued. Pomfrey worked through 3 more of the compulsions with the focused precision of someone who had been doing this for a week and had developed a rhythm for it. Harry sat through them, acknowledging what each one had been doing, what lifted when it left. Neville's removals went quietly, Pomfrey taking careful time with the compliance charms and Augusta watching with the still attention of someone paying penance. When it was done, and Neville sat blinking in the way you blink when something is different but you can't yet name exactly how, Augusta reached over and put her hand briefly on his. Not a word. Just that. He turned his hand over and held hers. Harry looked away to give them the moment. Sunday brought Hermione with a face that meant she'd finished something, and she laid a document on his hospital bed with the exactness of someone presenting evidence. 67 instances of documented behavioral modification across 12 identified individuals, she said. All carrying Dumbledore's primary signature, some with Fletcher's secondary. The 12 include you, Professor Snape, 3 other staff members, 2 order members, and 5 students. She paused. 5 students we know of. Harry looked at the document. The names were listed in Hermione's precise handwriting, and one of them made him go very still. Percy Weasley, he said. 6 compliance charms, she said quietly. Oriented toward ministry alignment and institutional authority. She met his eyes. Beginning roughly around his 3rd year. When he started, becoming what he became. Harry thought about Percy. Pompous, ambitious, estranged from his family, the family that had practically adopted Harry. He thought about the Weasleys at the Burrow and the specific grief of Ron's relationship with his older brother and Arthur's face when Percy's name came up. He thought about what it would mean for the Weasleys to know. Ron, he said. He needs to know, she said. Before it comes out another way. Harry nodded. Then he looked out the window at the grounds, where the early September light was doing something beautiful on the lake, and he said, Hermione. There are 5 students on that list. Yes. There are 500 students in this school. She understood immediately. He knew she understood because her expression shifted from researcher mode to something more human and more troubled. The scan was a one-time diagnostic. It identified charms present at the moment of casting. But it wasn't a historical audit, Harry said. It only showed what's active right now. Right now. What about the last 4 years? What about charms that were placed and removed without leaving a record? What about students who were charmed in ways that influenced their whole school experience and didn't show up on last Tuesday's scan because the charms had already done their work and been lifted? Hermione sat down on the edge of his bed and looked at the document in her hands. "We could be looking at significantly more," she said. "We're probably looking at significantly more," he said. The thing about the cold fire in his chest was that it had stopped being just anger. It had become something more useful than anger, a kind of clear, directional energy that knew where it was pointed. Toward Voldemort, yes, eventually, when the time was right. Toward the systems that had failed him and others like him. Toward building something, not just dismantling what was wrong, but constructing what should replace it. He thought about the defense curriculum. About Umbridge's classroom and the theory-only approach and 500 students who were going to face a returning Dark Lord with no practical preparation. He thought about what Neville had said about the Founder wards. About active prevention. He thought about the conversation he needed to have with Ron about Percy. He thought about Dumbledore outside the wards, still certain, still moving pieces, still operating from the belief that his calculus was correct and that eventually Harry would understand. He thought about all of it, and he felt the castle breathing around him, and he made a decision. He pushed off the bed, picked up his bag, and said to Hermione, "Come on. We need to find somewhere private." "For what?" "For the first meeting," he said. She stood up very quickly. "You've decided the shape." "I've decided the shape," he confirmed. "How many people?" "Anyone who wants to learn," he said. "Start with people we trust. But eventually, anyone who wants it." He held the door for her. "If the ministry's going to leave people defenseless, that's a choice. We get to make a choice too." They walked out into the corridor together and the castle's wards hummed around them with something that might, in a very old and architectural way, have been approval. Chapter 5, The War Inside the War. The attempt to recharm Harry happened on a Monday. He knew it was coming approximately 4 seconds before it arrived, which was exactly enough time to do something about it. He was walking back from the library alone, a deliberate choice, actually. He'd been testing his ward sense by moving through the castle solo and paying attention to what the wards showed him, when the corridor on the 4th floor did something that wasn't quite a sound and wasn't quite a feeling but landed somewhere between the two, a sharp alert that was the castle's equivalent of a shout. He stopped walking. The corridor was empty ahead of him. Torches burning. Suits of armor standing at their posts. A tapestry on the left wall depicting a wizard hunt that had always unsettled him slightly. Nothing visible. He waited. The flagstone 2 steps ahead of him had something underneath it. Not literally, not a physical object, but a magical construct, embedded, waiting for footfall to activate. Triggered proximity magic. He could feel it the way he could now feel all the ward-adjacent things, a kind of wrongness in the texture of the castle's ambient magic, a note that didn't belong in the chord. He crouched and examined it without touching it, the way you examine something you want to understand before deciding what to do with it. It was a compulsion construct. Crudely assembled compared to the ones Pomfrey had been removing, those had been sophisticated, layered, professional work. This was functional but hasty, the magical equivalent of a rough draft. The signature was unfamiliar. Not Dumbledore, not Fletcher. Someone else. Someone who knew enough to build it but had been working quickly, which meant either recent instruction or recent fear. Harry stood up. He took a different route to Gryffindor Tower, and as he walked he let the castle trace the construct's recent magical history through him. The ward sense had been developing all week, and by now he could do things with it he hadn't been able to do on the night of the Boundary Walk. He felt the construct's origin point, which was not the corridor itself but a room 3 floors up, and he felt the person who had placed it retreating back to that room approximately 12 minutes ago. He didn't confront them immediately. He went to find McGonagall. She was in her office, working through what appeared to be an archaeological quantity of administrative correspondence, the accumulated paperwork of a school abruptly between headmasters midterm, combined with the ministry's investigation, combined with parent owls that kept arriving in waves. She looked up when Harry knocked and came in. "Someone tried to recharm me," he said. 4th floor corridor, proximity-triggered compulsion construct. Roughly cast, recent placement. I traced it back to a room on the 7th floor. He paused. I didn't go there. I thought you should know first. McGonagall set down her quill. You're certain? She asked. Yes. She stood. Show me. They went to the 4th floor together. Harry pointed at the flagstone without approaching. McGonagall cast a careful diagnostic that confirmed what he'd said: compulsion construct, proximity triggered, 30 minutes old. She then cast a containment charm around it with the precise economy of a woman who had dealt with booby-trapped corridors before and found them personally offensive. I'll have it analyzed, she said. The caster signature may tell us something. She looked at Harry. You detected this from how far away? About 4 meters, he said. When I was closer I could read the structure of it. She looked at him for a moment. The ward sense. It's been developing since the boundary walk, he said. She didn't ask him when he'd walked the boundary, which meant either she'd known or had suspected. This construct is significantly less sophisticated than the charms Pomfrey has been removing. Either the caster is less skilled than Dumbledore, or this was done hastily, or both. Or Dumbledore sent instructions and the caster improvised from them, Harry said. Which means someone inside the castle is in communication with him. Yes, she said. It wasn't a surprise to her. He could see that it wasn't. How many staff members, Harry asked quietly, do you think are still reporting to him? I don't know, she said, which was the honest answer. I trust Pomfrey completely. Flitwick. Sprout. The others, she paused. Some will be doing it from loyalty. Some from the charms we've already identified. Some from simple uncertainty about who holds legitimate authority here. She looked at the contained flagstone. I've been trying to be careful about what information I share in full staff meetings. Someone in the staff knew my routine well enough to place this while I was in the library, Harry said. I was there for 90 minutes. Someone with knowledge of my schedule and access to the corridor. McGonagall's expression tightened by degrees. I'll conduct individual meetings with all staff today. Diagnostic scans where consented. And where not consented? That, she said evenly, will be informative in its own way. He left her to it and went to find the others, because the first meeting of what they'd been calling the group, no name yet, name felt premature, was scheduled for that evening in the room of requirement, and a recharming attempt was exactly the kind of thing the group needed to know about. The room itself had been Hermione's suggestion. The room of requirement, which Harry had used twice before without really understanding it, turned out to be considerably more sophisticated than a room that appeared when you needed something. When Harry approached it for the first time since the boundary walk with the ward sense operating, he understood it as a distinct node in the castle's ward network, a concentrated point of the founder magic, flexible by design, responsive to genuine need in ways that the rest of the castle was responsive in more fixed forms. When he walked past the blank stretch of wall for the 3rd time and thought, clearly and specifically, about what he needed, a space for people to learn to defend themselves properly, a space that was safe and couldn't be monitored by people who wanted to prevent exactly that, the door appeared. Inside was better than he'd expected. Not a classroom, that had been his vague mental image, desks and a blackboard, but something that felt like a large, well-lit practice space, the floor clear and good for movement, walls lined with bookshelves that appeared to contain defense texts, a central open area and breakout spaces around the perimeter. The ceiling was high enough for full-range spell practice. The room had, apparently, understood the assignment. 23 people showed up. Harry had asked Hermione and Ron and Neville and Luna. Then Neville had asked 3 Hufflepuffs he trusted. Hermione had asked 2 Ravenclaws. Ron had mentioned it to Ginny and Ginny had apparently told 6 Gryffindors with the characteristic Weasley approach of committing fully to things she thought were right. 2 Slytherins showed up, Draco Malfoy, which was expected given the corridor conversation, and Blaise Zabini, which was not. Harry looked at Zabini when he came through the door. Zabini looked back with the elegant neutrality of someone who had made a decision privately and wasn't interested in being interrogated about it. "Zabini," Harry said. "Potter," Zabini said. "Glad you're here," Harry said, and meant it, and Zabini's neutral expression shifted by about 2 degrees towards something warmer and less defended. Harry stood at the front of the room because that was the natural geography of it and didn't waste any time. "Here's the situation," he said, to 23 people ranging from 5th year to 7th. "Voldemort is back. That's not a debate, it's a fact, and everyone in this room is going to have to deal with it eventually because the alternative is waiting for it to deal with you. The Ministry is in denial and has appointed a defense teacher who is teaching you theory because they'd rather have 500 students who can describe a hex than 500 students who can stop one." He looked around the room. People were listening with the focused attention of those who have been waiting for someone to say something direct. "I'm not going to teach you because I'm famous," he continued. "I'm going to teach you because I've been in situations where the practical knowledge of defensive magic was the difference between living and not living, and I'd rather you have that knowledge and never need it than not have it and find out too late." He paused. "Also, I've been walking around with 41 suppression charms being removed all week and my magic is currently doing things I don't fully understand yet, so there may be some interesting unscheduled demonstrations." A few people laughed. The tension in the room shifted from apprehensive to something more like readied. "We'll start with Expelliarmus," he said. Ron, beside him, made a small sound. "I know," Harry said, to Ron, without looking at him. "But Expelliarmus has kept me alive twice in situations where more powerful spells didn't work, and I want to know that every person in this room can cast it reliably before we move to anything else." He looked at the group. "Pair up. I'll come around." They paired up. Harry moved through the room and it was different from anything he'd experienced as a student before. The thinking was clearer, the perception of what each person was doing wrong was immediate and specific. He could see, watching someone cast, exactly where the problem was: a wrist angle, a breath held at the wrong moment, an intent that was too broad or too hesitant, and when he corrected it, the correction was precise enough that it worked immediately. Neville's Expelliarmus, by the end of 20 minutes, was the best in the room. Harry stood in front of him after watching him disarm his partner 3 times running and said, "Your stance is completely natural. Do you know that?" "It's felt different since the charms came off," Neville said. He was slightly out of breath and looking at his wand with an expression of faint wonder. "Like I know what I'm doing." "You always knew what you were doing," Harry said. "Something was just telling you you didn't." He moved on to the next pair. Draco was working with Blaze and they were both technically accomplished, better raw form than most of the Gryffindors, actually, which Harry acknowledged without hesitation. "Good wrist control," he said to Draco, passing by. "You're telegraphing the intent by 3 seconds, though. Work on that." Draco blinked at the straightforward assessment. "Right. Practice concealing the movement until the last possible moment. It's not about speed yet. It's about opacity." "How do you?" Draco started, then stopped. "Know that?" Harry finished. "Practice. And apparently 30 years of suppressed lateral problem-solving suddenly accessible all at once." He moved to the next pair. "Keep going." An hour in, they were working through shield charms. Harry demonstrated his, the one that had alarmed Flitwick in class, and deliberately held it at half strength, which still filled about a third of the practice space with shimmering silver and made several people step back instinctively. "Full strength," Ginny said, from across the room. Her eyes were bright with the Weasley competitive intelligence. "Building up to it," Harry said. "You were already at full strength in charms on Wednesday," she said. "Seamus told me Flitwick went behind his desk." "Flitwick is shorter than his desk," Harry said. "Harry," Ginny said, in the tone of someone who has grown up with Fred and George and therefore has highly refined expectations for demonstrations of capability. Harry looked at her. Then he cast the shield charm at full strength. The room lit up. Not just the shimmer of the shield itself but the reactive brightness of 23 people's faces, and for a second the room of requirement felt like a place where something important was being established rather than just practiced. The shield was large enough to cover the entire group on Harry's side of the room, responsive at the edges, and when Hermione tested it with a jinx from across the room the jinx bounced back with enough force that she had to duck. "Sorry," Harry said. "No you're not," she said, but she was smiling. He let the shield drop. "That's what we're building toward. That's not inherent talent, that's the product of correct technique and genuine understanding of what the spell is doing." He looked around the room. "Any of you can get there. We'll get there." After the meeting, when the others had filtered out in twos and threes, Neville stayed behind. He was looking at the bookshelves the room had provided, running his finger along the spines. "The recharming attempt," he said, without turning around. "You heard. I was with Hermione when you told her." He pulled a book from the shelf, looked at the title, replaced it. "It means someone in the castle is in contact with Dumbledore. Someone willing to act. McGonagall is running staff diagnostics today," Harry said. "The person who placed it might not be staff," Neville said. He turned around. "A student could place it if they had the right instruction. Someone with the right parents, the right connections, the right motivation." He paused. "Or someone who's still under charms we haven't identified yet. Someone acting on compulsion without knowing they're acting at all." Harry had thought about this. The 41 remaining charms on him, those were identified and being addressed. But the wider question Hermione had raised about historical charms, about influences that had already done their work, that was open. And if there were students in this castle who had been charmed without the scan catching it, they might be vectors for exactly this kind of thing without any conscious intent. "I need to have a conversation with Dumbledore," Harry said. Neville looked at him. "Not on his terms," Harry said quickly. "Not in a meeting he arranges. I need to understand what he built. What the full picture is." He sat on the edge of a desk. He said he could explain. Not defend, explain. I think he means it. I think he genuinely believes the explanation will make sense to me. "And you want to hear it?" Neville asked. "I want to understand the architecture of what was done to me," Harry said. "Every charm has a purpose. Every purpose points to a plan. If I know the plan, all of it, not just the pieces I've recovered, I can work out what he was building toward. And working out what he was building toward helps me understand what's actually coming." "Voldemort," Neville said. "Voldemort," Harry agreed. "Whatever the prophecy says. Dumbledore has been positioning me for something specific. I want to know what it is before someone else tries to position me for it again. Or before Voldemort positions you for it," Neville said quietly. The word landed with the particular weight it had now that Harry was thinking about things without filters. Voldemort wasn't a distant abstract threat anymore. He was organized, embodied, and aware that Harry had been a managed asset for years. The shift in Harry's magical signature, the one Pomfrey had mentioned, the way a core starts to run differently when 40-plus charms come off, was not invisible to a legilimens of Voldemort's caliber. "He knows something changed," Harry said. "He's felt it. The link between us," he pressed 2 fingers against his scar briefly. "It's different now. Quieter. The charms were keeping it more open than it needed to be." "That's actually good," Neville said. "Yes," Harry said. "But it means he also knows I'm different. And he'll be curious about what I am now." The next morning at breakfast, a large, official-looking owl landed in front of Harry with a sealed letter bearing the Wisengamot crest. He opened it. It was from Robards. Albus Dumbledore had declined to present himself for voluntary questioning. His legal representative had submitted a written statement to the investigation asserting that the diagnostic scan's caster attribution methodology was unreliable, that the enchantments had been placed under extraordinary circumstances necessitating a different legal framework, and that the matter should be referred to the full Waisengemot rather than a departmental investigation. At the bottom of Robart's letter, in what appeared to be a handwritten postscript, "He has more allies on the Waisengemot than we anticipated. We are proceeding carefully." Harry set the letter down and picked up his pumpkin juice. "He's running it through the Waisengemot," Hermione said, reading over his shoulder in the unreconstructed way of their friendship that Harry had always found he didn't mind. "He controls the chief warlock position. He can stall the investigation almost indefinitely if he gets enough votes." "He won't be chief warlock much longer," Sirius said, from beside Harry. He'd taken to appearing at breakfast sporadically, using flow access that McGonagall had authorized. His presence at the Gryffindor table had stopped being remarkable around day 3. Marchbanks has been working against him on the Waisengemot for years. She's been waiting for something concrete and now she has it. She'll move to strip the chief warlock position on grounds of criminal investigation. A pause. Kasha filed 3 more evidentiary submissions yesterday. 2 of them reference Fletcher's written statement. "You found Fletcher," Harry said. "Fletcher found it expedient to cooperate," Sirius said, with an expression that communicated several things about the nature of that conversation. "You were unpleasant to him," Harry said. "I was extremely pleasant," Sirius said. "Which is worse, in my experience." At the other end of the Great Hall, Umbridge was eating breakfast and reading the Prophet with the concentrated attention of someone cross-referencing today's political weather against her own plans. She hadn't done anything formally objectionable since her first class. She was too smart for that, Harry thought. She was watching, collecting, building her case for whatever action she was planning. He could feel the ward sense registering her the same way it had every day, the castle's patient, watchful tension, waiting for her to give it grounds. He thought about the High Inquisitor powers that existed in certain ministry decrees. He'd heard about them from Sirius, who'd heard about them from Kasha, who had apparently been tracking the ministry's preparatory filings with the precision of a bloodhound. Umbridge wasn't just here to teach defense. She was here to take control of the school. The defense position was her entry point, and the educational decrees were her tools, and the ministry believed that with Dumbledore gone and the school in transitional leadership, the moment for institutional capture was now. He was going to make sure it wasn't. The defense group's second meeting was Wednesday. 23 became 31, because people had talked. Harry ran the session with the same directness as the first and they got through stunning spells, the mechanics of it, the common errors, the defensive implications of knowing exactly how it felt to be on the receiving end, and by the end of the session Ginny Weasley was casting a stunner that hit the practice dummy hard enough to send it into the wall. "That," Harry said, looking at the dent in the practice dummy, "is what I mean about intent. Your intent was absolutely clear." "I pictured Malfoy," Ginny said. From across the room, "I heard that," Draco said. "You were meant to," Ginny said sweetly. "Your stunner isn't bad either," Draco said, with the studied nonchalance of someone trying very hard not to admit they're complimenting a Weasley. "Thank you," Ginny said, in a tone of exaggerated surprise. Harry looked between them and said nothing, because some developments were self-managing. On Thursday evening, Voldemort sent something. Harry knew at the moment it crossed the ward boundary. The sensation was different from anything else the ward sense had given him, darker, more specific, carrying the signature of dark magic that had a direction and an intent. Not a person, not through the boundary, the Founder wards wouldn't allow a physical incursion, Death Eaters couldn't simply walk onto Hogwarts grounds. But something else. A projection. A legilimency-adjacent construction that wasn't a physical presence but was trying to be, reaching across the distance with the particular quality of very old, very powerful dark magic feeling its way along a familiar channel. The channel was Harry. He was in the common room when it arrived. He set down what he was reading and pressed his fingers to his scar and felt the probe moving along the link between them, cautious, intelligent, measuring rather than attacking. Voldemort, testing the new shape of things. assessing what Harry had become. He didn't close down the link. He didn't panic. He sat very still and let the probe move, and he looked back down it. He wasn't sure this was strategically correct, but it was honest, and he'd decided to operate honestly and with full awareness, which meant not reflexively flinching from anything including this. What he got was not a window into Voldemort's mind. The connection didn't work cleanly in either direction right now, with the charms being removed and the link changing shape. What he got was more like an impression, the quality of the attention on the other end. The way a Dark Lord who has been operating from absolute certainty for decades feels when something he thought was controlled and predictable suddenly isn't. Voldemort was curious. And underneath the curiosity, like a ground note under music, something that might in a human being have been called unease. Harry sent nothing back. He simply withdrew. Not with fear. With the clean closure of someone ending a conversation on their own terms. The probe receded. He sat in the common room for a moment, then went to find Hermione. She was in the hospital wing, where she'd taken to doing her evening research because the light was better and Pomfrey occasionally provided tea and nobody disturbed them there. She looked up when he came in. "The link," he said. Her expression went immediately alert. "What happened?" "Voldemort sent a probe along the connection. Testing the new shape of things." He sat on the edge of his bed. I looked back. "Harry, I know," he said. "But I need to understand what's on the other end of that connection. Not to use it, to defend against it. I can't close my eyes to it every time and hope it goes away." He looked at her. "Dumbledore's approach was to train me without telling me about the link. To manage my exposure. That was the charms, that was part of what was being managed. Because if you understood the legitimacy link you might understand other things," Hermione said slowly. "Things about the connection between you two. Things about why Dumbledore was so specifically invested in shaping you." "The prophecy," Harry said. "You don't know what it says." "No," he said. "But I know Dumbledore does. And I know his entire approach to my life has been oriented around it. And I think it's time I knew it too." She was quiet for a moment. "You could go to the Department of Mysteries. The prophecy is there, the physical record. But it's in the Hall of Prophecy and you'd need to." "I don't need the physical record," Harry said. "Dumbledore knows it. He's offered to explain." He looked at her steadily. "I'm going to take the meeting. On your terms." "Absolutely on my terms." He paused. "Will you set it up?" "Through Kasha. I want it arranged properly, neutral location, my solicitor present, formal record of the conversation. Not a friendly chat. A documented meeting." She reached for her notebook. "I'll write to Kasha tonight." "There's something else," Harry said. She looked up. "The person who placed the compulsion construct," he said. "McGonagall ran the staff diagnostics. No one on staff cast it. Which means it was a student." "I've been thinking about that," Hermione said. She turned to a page she'd already been working on. Based on the magical signature McGonagall extracted from the construct, it was young magic. Student-level casting. But the design was too sophisticated for it to be self-taught. Someone gave them the pattern. She turned the notebook toward him. There was a diagram of the magical construct with annotations. Whoever built this was working from instructions. Not improvised instructions, written ones. The construct has the hallmarks of a method that was taught carefully to someone who then executed it imperfectly. Who did Dumbledore have access to? Harry asked. Students who visited him regularly, who might receive correspondence without it being obvious. They looked at each other. Prefects, they said simultaneously. Not all prefects, not even most. But Dumbledore had met with prefects regularly as headmaster. He'd cultivated specific students as informal informants over the years, not obviously, not crassly, but in the way a politically intelligent person cultivates relationships with useful people. An owl to a student from Dumbledore wouldn't necessarily be flagged. A former headmaster staying in contact with a student they'd mentored, plausible and unthreatening on the surface. "I need a list," Harry said. "Already making one," Hermione said. He stood. He was tired in the way he'd been tired every evening this week, the particular drain of operating at full capacity for the first time in his life, his mind genuinely working, his magic genuinely running, his emotions genuinely present. It was exhausting in the way that exercise is exhausting, productive, the good kind, the kind that means you're getting stronger. 37 charms remaining. He was more than halfway through. He said goodnight to Hermione and walked back to Gryffindor Tower, and the castle walked with him in the way it had been doing since the Boundary Walk. The ward sensed a constant background presence like the feeling of home. In the morning there was a commotion before breakfast. Harry heard it from the 4th floor, raised voices, a slammed door, the particular acoustic quality of conflict in an institution that had very few walls thick enough to truly contain it. He changed course and followed it. The source was the corridor outside Umbridge's office. She'd established an office, which itself was a statement, and the person standing in the corridor outside it was Snape. Not inside the office. In the corridor, having apparently just come from inside the office, wearing the expression of a man who has had a conversation he found deeply unpleasant and is now controlling his response to it with every tool available to him. Harry stopped a few feet away. Snape looked at him. Not the usual look, not the flat contempt that Harry had spent 5 years interpreting as fundamental character and was now, with better calibration, recognizing as a complex layering of genuine dislike, forced compliance, and something else that was much more difficult to categorize. "She wants a list," Snape said. His voice was very even. "Of students she considers problematic. Students whose behavior or associations she finds politically inconvenient." A pause, so brief it was almost not there. "She asked me to provide one." Harry waited. "I declined," Snape said. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, without decoration, in the tone of a man who considers explanation a form of weakness. But there was something in the words that was different from what Harry would have expected even 3 days ago. There was choice in it. Not managed deference, not charmed compliance. A decision. "She won't let that go," Harry said. "No," Snape agreed. "She'll go around you. Find someone else to provide the list." "Also yes," Snape said. He was looking at Harry with the complex, undecodable expression that Harry was increasingly understanding as Snape thinking much more than he was saying. "You should know that she sent an owl to the ministry this morning requesting educational decree authorization. She intends to establish formal inspection authority over all staff members." "I know," Harry said. "We've been tracking her." Snape's expression shifted by a fraction. "Have you?" "We have," Harry said. He looked at the man who had been his most consistent antagonist for 5 years and thought about Fletcher's secondary signature and the 7 charms and thought about Neville saying compliance charms, oriented around professional loyalty. He thought about what it meant to spend 10 years operating under behavioral constraints that made you less than what you were, in an environment you hated, for a person you had complicated reasons to trust. "For what it's worth," he said carefully, "whatever happened with the charms they found on you, I'm not counting that against you." Snape was very still. "I'm not forgiving anything," Harry said. "I'm just contextualizing it differently. That's all." He held Snape's gaze. "The group meeting on Wednesdays. The defense group. If you wanted to come, not as a teacher, not in any official capacity, just to be in the room. There's space." The silence stretched long enough that Harry thought the answer was going to be a flat refusal, which was fine, he'd offered. Then Snape said, "I'll consider it." Which, in the language of Severus Snape, was almost certainly yes. Harry nodded once and walked on to breakfast, and behind him the castle hummed with the particular quality of something having been set in motion that would matter later. At breakfast the owl that arrived was large and carried ministry markings and contained a copy of Educational Decree No. 23, signed and effective immediately, establishing the position of Hogwarts High Inquisitor and appointing Dolores Umbridge to that role. Harry read it once, set it down, and looked at the head table where Umbridge was receiving her own copy with the contained satisfaction of someone whose plan was unfolding on schedule. McGonagall read her copy with an expression like controlled weather. Harry reached for the marmalade. "How long did we say before she tried to use official authority?" he said to Hermione. "I said a week." Ron said 5 days. "It's day 6, Harry said. "Split the difference," Ron said, eating toast. "Right," Harry said. He spread marmalade with the careful attention of someone whose mind was elsewhere. "She has Inquisitor authority now. That means she can observe classes, interview staff and students, overrule administrative decisions. She can't overrule McGonagall on student welfare decisions," Hermione said. "The Founder Ward supersede Ministry educational authority in matters of student safety. That's in the founding charter, which I've now read 3 times. "She doesn't know that," Harry said. "She will when she tries," Hermione said. "When she tries," Harry repeated. He thought about the ward sense, the castle's patient watchfulness, the specific tension that gathered in the ambient magic around Umbridge's office every time she sent an official communication. The castle has been waiting for her to cross a specific line. Observation and inspection isn't the line. He looked at his plate. Harming a student is the line. "She'll try to use the Inquisitor authority to remove students from the group," Neville said, from beside Harry. He'd arrived quietly at some point in the last 2 minutes. "When she finds out the group exists, and she will find out, probably soon, she'll move to ban it and then to punish the people in it." "She'll try," Harry agreed. "What do we do when she does?" Harry looked up from his marmalade. Around the Great Hall, 500 students were eating breakfast in the ordinary way of a morning that didn't yet know what was coming. Down the table, Ron was eating. Beside him, Hermione was already composing a counter-argument in her head. Harry could see it from the shape of her concentration. Behind him, Neville was waiting with the patient steadiness he'd been developing all week, the steadiness of someone who has recently discovered that they are more than they were told they were. At the staff table, McGonagall was reading the decree with the expression of someone preparing to do something careful and thorough and absolutely not gentle. At the end of the staff table, Umbridge was smiling. Harry looked at her for 1 moment. Then he looked back at his breakfast and said, "We let her try. And then we let the castle handle what the castle can handle. And what the castle can't handle," he paused, and the cold fire burned with the steady, directional heat it had been building toward all week, "we handle ourselves." He picked up his pumpkin juice. Around him, the great hall moved and breathed and prepared itself for the day, and somewhere below the stone and the wards and the ancient institutional magic of the oldest school in Britain, the foundations of a war inside a war were settling into a shape that nobody, not Dumbledore outside the boundary, not Voldemort in his recovered stronghold, not Umbridge with her ministry decrees, had yet fully understood they were facing. Chapter 6, The Boy Who Chose the Meeting with Dumbledore was set for Saturday. Kasia had arranged it with the particular efficiency of someone who understood that neutral ground was a fiction and had therefore chosen ground that was as close to actually neutral as the current situation allowed, a private room at the Hog's Head in Hogsmeade, which was outside the Hogwarts ward boundary but close enough that Harry could feel the castle at his back. Aberforth Dumbledore, who ran the place and had complicated feelings about his brother that he'd expressed to Kasia in 6 words that she'd declined to repeat verbatim, had consented to host and had promised that the room would be private and that he would personally ensure nobody went near it. Harry told Sirius on Friday evening. Sirius's first response was physical. He stood up from his chair and walked to the window of McGonagall's sitting room where they'd been talking, and stood there for a moment with his hands behind his neck. Then he turned around. "I want to be there," he said. "I know. You're going to tell me I can't." "I'm going to tell you that you can be in the building," Harry said. In the bar. With Aberforth, who will give you a drink that I suspect you'll actually need. He looked at his godfather. This isn't a conversation you can be in the room for, Sirius. Not because I don't want you there. Because if you're there it becomes about your anger and his guilt and everything between you and James and the whole history of it, and I need it to be about information. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. You're 15. I know. James was never this. At 15 James was brilliant and funny and completely incapable of having this kind of conversation. James had different problems, Harry said. I've had a very specific education. He paused. In the worst possible way, but still. Sirius exhaled. Sat back down. Kasia will be in the room? Kasia will be in the room. And you'll tell me everything afterward. Everything, Harry said. I'm done with information being managed. Sirius looked at him with the expression that kept appearing on his face this week, the pride and the apprehension in equal measure, the recognition of something he hadn't expected to see. All right, he said. I'll be in the bar. Try not to start any fights with Aberforth, Harry said. I make no promises, Sirius said. Saturday morning, Harry sat through his removal session first. Pomfrey took 3 more, bringing him to 34 remaining, and the 3 that came off that morning were a connected set that had been working in concert, a kind of ambient certainty that Dumbledore's version of events was the correct version, that his perspective was reliable and his judgment sound. Pomfrey identified them as the most recently placed of all the charms, cast in the last 2 years, which meant Dumbledore had been reinforcing the architecture of Harry's trust in him specifically during the period when that trust had been most needed and most tested. Harry sat with that for the full 20 minutes Pomfrey required between removals. You're angry, she observed. Yep, he said. Good, she said, which was not what he'd expected from Pomfrey. She saw his expression and added, you're going to need it this morning. Not to lose control of, to know it's yours. He got dressed, collected Kasia from the 3 broomsticks where she was already drinking coffee and reading something dense and legal, and walked to the Hog's Head through the cold September morning with the castle behind him and the meeting ahead and the anger sitting cleanly in his chest like a coal, not consuming anything, just burning. The private room was small and smelled of old wood and something alcoholic and time. A table, 4 chairs, a window that looked onto a side alley. Kasia sat to his left. 2 empty chairs across. Dumbledore arrived exactly on time. He came in with Elphia's Doge, his ancient companion and apparent current support, who Kasia looked at once and said, this was agreed as a 1-to-1 meeting plus legal representation only. Doge started to protest. Dumbledore put a hand briefly on his arm and said, wait outside, Elphia's, and Doge looked at him with the distressed loyalty of someone who had been worrying about this man for 60 years and went back through the door. Dumbledore sat down. He looked older than Harry remembered. Not dramatically, not falsely, just the ordinary aging of a man who had not been sleeping well, whose certainties had absorbed a significant structural shock even if they hadn't collapsed. The long white beard was the same. The half-moon spectacles were the same. The eyes, those very blue eyes that Harry had always found deeply comforting, that he now understood had been partly a trained response, were the same, looking at him with the full weight of their attention. Harry, he said. Mr. Dumbledore, Harry said. Something moved across Dumbledore's face at the address. Not hurt, exactly, the recognition of a boundary drawn. He accepted it. You look well, he said. I am well, Harry said. Better every day. He let that land for a moment. Kasia is here as my legal representative and is recording this conversation. You can leave at any point. I'm not compelling you to be here. But I want you to know that whatever you say is on record. I understand, Dumbledore said. Good. Harry put his hands flat on the table, a deliberate choice, open, visible, nothing concealed. Tell me about the prophecy. Dumbledore blinked, which was rare. He'd clearly prepared for a different opening. I had expected we might, the prophecy, Harry said again. Start there. A pause. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone reassessing the architecture of a conversation they'd spent time planning. Then he folded his hands on the table with the settled gravity of a man making a choice about honesty. The prophecy was made 16 years ago, he said. By Sybil Trelawney, to me, in an interview at the Hog's Head. She said, he paused, and then recited it with the precision of someone who had carried the words for 16 years, the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. The words settled into the room like stones dropped into water. Harry sat with them for a long moment. He turned them over carefully, the way he was turning over everything now, looking at the structure, the logic, the implications. Either must die at the hand of the other, he said. Yes. Neither can live while the other survives. Yes. That's what the charms were for, Harry said. Not a question. Not just loyalty, not just compliance, you were shaping me into something capable of killing Voldemort and willing to die doing it. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. You needed me brave enough to face him and obedient enough not to ask too many questions and attached enough to other people that I'd sacrifice myself without being told to. Dumbledore's expression was something that had grief all through it, like grief was load-bearing. I needed you prepared. You needed me manageable, Harry said. There's a difference. In my view, Dumbledore said carefully, at the time, they were the same thing. A boy who asked too many questions, who developed his power too quickly, who understood his own situation too clearly, was a boy who might make choices that, he stopped. That served his own interests, Harry finished. Rather than the plan. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. There is a war, Harry. There are lives at stake. Hundreds of thousands of lives. I have seen what Voldemort does and I have spent 50 years of my life working against it. Every decision I made, every decision you made, Harry said, was made without my knowledge or consent. I was an infant when the first charms went on. I couldn't consent. I couldn't choose. You made every decision for me, about me, without me, from the first days of my life. He kept his voice even. You chose where I lived. You chose what I felt. You chose what I was capable of noticing. You chose my friendships and my loyalties and my capacity for grief and my attachment to this school and my trust in you. He paused. The only thing you didn't choose was whether I'd survive. And I think that's because you actually couldn't guarantee it, and that limitation is the only reason I have any agency left at all. The room was very quiet. Dumbledore did not look away. That was the thing about him, he had the courage of his convictions in the way that made him both formidable and catastrophic. He didn't flinch from what he'd done. He sat with it. You're right, he said. Harry had expected more argument. The directness of the admission recalibrated him slightly. I made those decisions, Dumbledore said. I made them with full knowledge of what I was doing. I believed, I still believe, that the alternative was worse. A boy raised without the charms, fully aware of the prophecy from an early age, coming into his power without guidance or constraint, there are several ways that story ends, Harry, and most of them end badly for everyone. You don't know that, Harry said. No, Dumbledore acknowledged. I don't. I made a calculation. The calculation may have been wrong. He looked at his hands briefly. The scale of the intervention, the number of charms, the depth of them, I recognize that it exceeds what I would have chosen if I had been less. He paused again, and this was the closest Harry had seen him come to a genuinely uncomfortable word, less certain of my own judgment. Less arrogant, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore said quietly. Less arrogant. Kasia was writing steadily beside Harry, recording every word. She hadn't looked up. "I want to ask you something else," Harry said. "The prophecy says I have a power the Dark Lord knows not." "What is it?" Dumbledore looked at him. "I have my theory." "Tell me." "Love," Dumbledore said. "Your capacity for love, for genuine human connection. Voldemort cannot understand it and cannot replicate it and has consistently underestimated it as a force." He held Harry's gaze. "That power has always been yours, Harry. The charms didn't manufacture it. They shaped how it expressed, the direction of it, the objects of it, but the capacity was always genuinely yours." Harry thought about that. "You charmed who I loved," he said. "The direction of my love. The loyalties. Some of them," Dumbledore said. "But not the capacity for it." "That I could not touch," Dumbledore said, and for the first time in the conversation he sounded like something other than a man giving testimony. He sounded like someone describing something that had genuinely surprised him. "You were remarkably resistant to the dampeners in that specific area. I had to work around it, rather than over it. Your love for your friends, the genuine attachment, every attempt to moderate it was absorbed and outgrown." He paused. "You were always more than what I needed you to be." The silence stretched between them like something physical. "You're not sorry," Harry said finally. "Not in the way that would actually change anything. You're sorry it was discovered. You're sorry the calculation became visible. But if you could go back, if I could go back," Dumbledore said, very slowly, "I would do less. Not none, I cannot in good conscience say none, because the alternative outcomes are genuinely terrible. But less." He looked at Harry. "I would trust you more. I think I was afraid of what you might become without management, and I think that fear was a failure of imagination. You are considerably more than I imagined." "I know," Harry said. Something almost shifted in Dumbledore's expression then, almost became the ghost of a smile, quickly contained. "The prophecy," Harry said. "Either must die at the hand of the other. I want to know what you believe that means practically. Not the words, your interpretation of the endgame." Dumbledore hesitated for the first time in the conversation. "Tell me," Harry said. "There is a piece of Voldemort's soul," Dumbledore said, "that I believe, I have believed for some time, lodged itself in you on the night of the curse. The night your mother died. The curse rebounded, and Voldemort was destroyed as a physical entity, but a fragment of his soul survived. It survived in you." Harry held very still. "I believe you are, in the technical terminology, a Horcrux," Dumbledore said. "An unintended one. And I believe that for Voldemort to be truly destroyed, permanently, entirely, that piece of his soul must also be destroyed." The words landed in the room like something heavy and irreversible. Harry sat with them. He turned them over. He examined them from every angle he could reach in the approximately 15 seconds he allowed himself before speaking, and in those 15 seconds he did something that the old Harry, the charmed Harry, the managed Harry, might not have been able to do. He thought about it clearly. "So your plan," he said, "was to raise me, prepare me, send me against Voldemort, and have me die in the process so that the Horcrux in me was destroyed. After which Voldemort would be mortal and someone else would finish him." Dumbledore's expression was the answer. "You were raising a sacrificial lamb," Harry said. "I was hoping," Dumbledore said carefully, "that you might survive it. There are ways, the killing curse, aimed at you specifically, might destroy only the fragment and leave you, might," Harry said. "Might," Dumbledore admitted. Harry leaned back in his chair. He was aware of a sensation he couldn't immediately name. It took him a moment to identify it, and when he did, it surprised him. It wasn't rage. He'd expected rage. It was something colder and more clarifying than rage. It was the feeling of a problem becoming fully visible. "Right," he said. "Here's the thing about that plan." He put his hands back on the table. It's a bad plan. Dumbledore blinked again. It relies on me not knowing, Harry said. The entire architecture of it, the charms, the management, the positioning, depends on me walking into a situation without full information and making the choice a person makes when they don't know all their options. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. I have a different approach. Harry, I'm going to destroy the Horcrux in me without dying, Harry said. I don't know exactly how yet. But I know it's theoretically possible because the soul fragment is unintended, which means it was never fully integrated, which means there may be a means of extraction or neutralization that doesn't require killing the host. He paused. I also know that Voldemort made other Horcruxes. More than one. The diary from second year was one. There are others. And I know that if we destroy those first, the fragment in me becomes less critical to the endgame timing. The silence that followed was the most complete of the conversation. Dumbledore looked at him across the table. Something in his expression was, Harry couldn't quite name it. The closest word was wonder, but filtered through grief and a complicated pride that had no clean place to go. How did you? Dumbledore began. The diary, Harry said. I've been thinking about it since the charms started coming off. Tom Riddle's diary was more than an enchanted object. It was responsive. It was him, in a functional way. When I destroyed it, something ended. Something that was him ended. He kept his gaze level. You knew about the diary. You knew what it was. And you said nothing. No, Dumbledore said. I said nothing. How many others are there? A pause. I have theories, Dumbledore said. 6 Horcruxes was the number that interested Voldemort when he was young, a number with magical significance to him. He made at least 3 that I can identify with reasonable certainty. Tell me. Dumbledore told him. The locket of Slytherin. The cup of Hufflepuff. The snake, Nagini, who was almost certainly a living Horcrux. His ring, already destroyed, which made Harry's eyes narrow because that meant Dumbledore had been conducting this hunt alone, without telling anyone, and had apparently already retrieved and destroyed one and had nearly died doing it based on the state of his hand. Your hand, Harry said. Dumbledore glanced at his blackened right hand. He'd been keeping it under the table. The ring was cursed, he said. I was not careful enough. You nearly killed yourself destroying a Horcrux in secret, Harry said, rather than share the information with anyone who could help. Dumbledore paused. Yes. That's the same problem, Harry said. Different shape. You keep deciding alone. You keep calculating alone. You keep protecting everyone from information because you don't trust anyone else to handle it. He looked at him. That's not strategy anymore. That's a compulsion. Dumbledore was very still. I'm not going to be managed, Harry said. Not by you, not by Voldemort, not by the Ministry, not by anyone. I'm going to fight this war, our war, the whole wizarding world's war, and I'm going to fight it with full information and full capability and people I actually trust and choose. He leaned forward slightly. But here is what I want to know from you, and I want you to be completely honest. Is there anything else I need to know? Anything else you've been holding back that directly affects my survival or my capacity to end this? The longest pause yet. Dumbledore looked at Harry Potter across a table in a small room above a pub in Hogsmeade, and he looked at him the way you look at something that has exceeded everything you built it to be, and he said, the connection between you and Voldemort, the legitimacy link, it runs both ways. I was using it. I know. I was using the link. The charms were partly designed to keep the channel open in a managed way, enough that information could flow in directions I could monitor. He paused. When the charms are fully removed, the link will change. It may weaken. It may close. Or it may become something I control rather than something that controls me, Harry said. Dumbledore nodded slowly. There is precedent for a skilled occlumens to invert the link. To use it actively rather than passively. I had intended to train you in occlumency this year. I had intended, he stopped. I had many intentions. I'll find someone to teach me occlumency, Harry said. On my terms. Snape is the most skilled legilimens you'll have access to, Dumbledore said. I know, Harry said. He'll be difficult. Everything worth doing is difficult, Harry said. I've noticed that difficulty was one of the things being managed down. I was being made comfortable with limitation. He paused. I'm not comfortable with limitation anymore. He looked at Dumbledore for a moment, the full measure of the man, the genius and the arrogance and the genuine love for humanity that was real and also insufficient, the terrible certainty and the real grief and the 60 years of sacrifice and control all wound together into something that was impressive and catastrophic simultaneously. I'm not going to forgive you, Harry said. Not now. Maybe not for a long time. You took things from me that I don't have a complete inventory of yet, and I'm not going to pretend that's resolvable in a single conversation. He held Dumbledore's gaze. But I'm also not going to spend my energy on hatred. I'm going to spend my energy on the war. And if there's information you have that's relevant to fighting it, about Horcruxes, about Voldemort's history, about the things you've learned in 50 years of studying him, I want access to it. Dumbledore looked at him. Through Kasha, Harry said. Formally documented. Nothing passed through personal meetings where I'm vulnerable to influence. Information only. He paused. Is that acceptable? Another long pause. Yes, Dumbledore said. That is acceptable. Harry nodded. He pushed back his chair. Then we're done for today. He stood. He was aware of the full height of himself, not dramatic, not performed, just the physical reality of a 15-year-old boy who had been through a week that had redrawn every map he had, standing in a small room above a pub on a Saturday morning with the conversation he'd needed to have finally behind him. Dumbledore remained seated. He was looking at Harry with the expression of a man watching something he set in motion go somewhere he didn't intend and finding that it is, despite everything, going somewhere true. Harry, he said, as Harry reached the door. Harry turned. The power the Dark Lord knows not, Dumbledore said quietly. I told you it was love. That was part of it. He paused, as though deciding something. But I think, now, watching you this week, watching you become, I think it may also be this. Your capacity to choose. Every attempt to manage that capacity has failed, ultimately. You chose your friends. You chose to come back from the graveyard. You chose, last Tuesday, to sit down and finish your dinner when the world was on fire. He held Harry's gaze. The prophecy says he will have power the Dark Lord knows not. Voldemort has never chosen freely in his life. He has only pursued. He doesn't know what choice looks like from the inside. A pause. I think that might matter. Harry stood at the door and thought about that. It will, he said. And went through it. Sirius was at the bar, as promised, nursing something amber with the controlled patience of a man who had committed to not coming through the door and was finding it cost him. He looked up when Harry appeared. Well, he said. There's a lot to tell you, Harry said. Horcruxes. The prophecy. The link. He sat on the bar stool beside him. Buy me a butterbeer and I'll start from the beginning. Sirius waved at Aberforth, who produced a butterbeer with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting for this transaction. Harry told him. All of it. He told it straight and complete, nothing softened or filtered, and Sirius listened with the focused, occasionally volcanic attention of a man processing things that required volcanic responses but who had committed to waiting until Harry was finished. By the end of it the amber in Sirius's glass was untouched and his hands were flat on the bar and he was staring at the wall behind Aberforth. The Horcruxes, Sirius said finally. Yes. He was building toward you dying. He thought it was necessary. I want to. Sirius stopped himself with visible effort. I want to say something about Dumbledore right now that would make even Aberforth uncomfortable. Probably, Aberforth said, from across the bar. But I'm not going to, Sirius said. Because you've already handled it and you don't need my outrage on top of it. He picked up his glass. Put it down again. You're not going to die for this. No, Harry said. I'm not. You're absolutely sure that the Horcrux can be removed without? Not sure, Harry said. Confident. There's a difference. I'm working on the theory. Hermione is working on the theory. There are people at St. Mungo's who specialize in soul magic who Kasia is going to contact this week. He picked up his butterbeer. We're going to work the problem. Properly. With all the information. Sirius looked at him. And meanwhile, Voldemort is reorganizing. Testing the link. Waiting to see what I am now. Harry drank his butterbeer. We have time. Not unlimited time, but time. He's not ready for a direct confrontation yet and neither are we, and he knows it. What we have right now is the period before the storm, and I intend to use every day of it. He thought about what needed to happen in the days ahead. The remaining 34 charms, the removal work continuing, each one bringing him closer to the full running of his own capabilities. The defense group, growing, improving, the students of Hogwarts building practical skills the Ministry was trying to deny them. Umbridge, who would make her move soon, whose Inquisitor authority would collide with the Founder wards at some point and when it did the castle would respond and he needed to be ready to support that response. Snape, acclumency, the confrontation of learning from a person who had strong reasons to dislike him, the necessity of it. The Horcrux question, enormous, complex, dangerous, the most important single problem besides the direct threat of Voldemort himself. And Percy Weasley. He'd told Ron on Friday night, after the research had confirmed the compliance charms, and Ron had gone very still in the specific way that Ron went still when something was too large to immediately process. He hadn't cried, Ron rarely cried, or showed it clearly when he did, but he'd sat in silence for a long time and then said, so the Percy thing wasn't entirely Percy. Some of it was Percy, Harry had said honestly. The ambition was his. But the specific direction of it, the Ministry alignment, the estrangement from your family, that was shaped. Ron had been quiet another long time. Then, someone's going to have to tell Mom and Dad. Yes, Harry had agreed. They're going to want to do something about it. Get him the removals. That'll be Percy's choice, Harry had said. He's 17. He can consent or not. Ron had nodded slowly. He'll be angry, he'd said. When he understands what was done to him. He'll be so angry. Yes, Harry had said. He will be. Good, Ron had said, with a fierceness that was entirely his own. Harry finished his butterbeer and set the glass down. Beside him, Sirius had finally started on his amber drink, which meant he was processing, which was good. Come back to the castle, Harry said. McGonagall said you can stay through the weekend. There's a defense meeting tomorrow, unofficial, the room of requirement, and I'd like you there. To participate? Sirius raised an eyebrow. To teach, Harry said. You were an Auror-trained duelist. Your practical knowledge of offensive and defensive magic is better than anyone currently in that room, including me. He looked at him. Unless you'd rather spend Sunday in the bar. Sirius looked at Aberforth. Aberforth looked back with the expression of someone who didn't care either way. The bar has its merits, Sirius said. The bar will still be here, Harry said. The war won't wait. Sirius considered this for approximately 3 seconds and then stood up, dropping coins on the bar, and said, right then. Show me this room of requirement. They walked back through Hogsmeade in the September morning, the village quiet around them on a Saturday, shopkeepers beginning to open, a few early students from the school browsing Honeyduck's window. The castle was visible from the high street, it always was, the towers rising above the tree-line, the whole mass of it presiding over the valley with the settled authority of 7 centuries. Harry felt it as they approached the ward boundary on the path up to the school, the shift in the ambient magic, the familiar threshold, the sense of the castle registering his return the way the wards had been registering things since the boundary walk. He stepped through without slowing. The wards hummed around him. Present, aware, patient. He walked up the path toward the front steps. The morning was cold and clear and the grounds were starting to fill with students taking advantage of the weekend. He could see a Quidditch pickup game starting in the distance, and someone flying a brightly colored kite near the lake, and a group of second years clearly doing something experimental with levitation charms that a prefect was going to need to address shortly. Normal. Messy, specific, ordinary. He stopped at the top of the steps and turned and looked back over the grounds, the lake catching the light, the forest dark along the edge, Hogsmeade just visible in the valley. Somewhere beyond the visible horizon, Voldemort. Somewhere in the other direction, the Ministry and its managed truths and its instinct for comfortable denial. Somewhere outside the ward boundary, Dumbledore, still certain, still moving pieces, now doing it with less information and less access. Behind him, the castle. He felt it, the wards, the stone, the 7th-century-old institutional consciousness of a place that had made a judgment and held it, that had watched him for 5 years and seen what was being done to him and waited for the right moment to act. The place that had expelled Dumbledore live in front of everyone and then, quietly, over the following week, had opened a channel of perception and communication with the one person in the building it had decided to trust with it. He put his hand briefly on the stone of the doorframe. The same gesture he'd made on the night of the boundary walk. The stone hummed under his palm. He had 34 compulsion charms still being removed. He had a soul fragment of a Dark Lord somewhere in his head that needed to be extracted without killing him. He had a High Inquisitor in the castle who was going to make a move within days. He had a defense group that was growing and needed teaching and would eventually need to be ready for something more than practice. He had a prophecy that said he would either kill or be killed, and he had decided that the prophecy described a destination not a method and he was going to find his own route there. He had Ron, who chose friendship consciously and completely. He had Hermione, who was the most dangerous researcher in the castle and whose loyalty was absolutely her own. He had Neville, who had been braver than anyone gave him credit for and was discovering exactly how much. He had Luna, who saw clearly without trying to see anything in particular. He had Sirius, behind him on the path, who had survived 12 years in Azkaban on the strength of knowing he was innocent and had come out of it choosing love rather than bitterness. He had the castle, which had ancient opinions about harm and protection and had not hesitated when the time came to enforce them. He was 15 years old. He had been shaped and managed and charmed and steered and positioned for a specific ending that he had now refused. He had, as of this morning, full knowledge of the plan that had been built around him. And he had decided that knowing the plan was not the same as following it. Sirius came up the steps beside him and stood there for a moment, looking out at the same view. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Harry took his hand off the stone. Turned toward the door. "I'm thinking," he said, "that it's time to stop being the piece on someone else's board and start being the person playing." He went inside. The castle door swung shut behind them with the sound of old wood and iron in a cold morning, solid and real, the sound of a place with weight and permanence and the long patient will of something that had decided whose side it was on. In the room of requirement, 31 students were waiting. In the hospital wing, Pomfrey had 3 more removal sessions scheduled for the week. In Cash's briefcase, an evidence file that was 3 days from being submitted to the Wisengamot. In the dark of his stronghold, Voldemort was thinking about a changed magical signature and what it meant. In the corridor outside his study, Percy Weasley was reading a letter from his mother that Molly had written 3 times before sending, each draft more careful than the last, because she was trying to say something true in a way that would reach him. In the Great Hall, One chair at the center of the high table sat with someone different in it, and the school moved around that difference with the careful adjustment of a living thing adapting to something new, which was, in the end, what schools were for. And Harry Potter walked down the corridor toward the room of requirement with Sirius at his shoulder and the cold fire burning steady and clean in his chest, not rage anymore, not fear, something that had been refined through a week of removal and revelation and deliberate choice into the specific quality of a person who knows what they are and what they're doing and has decided, fully and without apology, to do it. He pushed the door open. 23 people, 31 now, more tomorrow, looked up. "Right," he said. "Let's get to work."